Hey guys, tonight we're taking a stroll through the crowded, noisy, delightfully chaotic streets of 19th century Paris. Imagine the clatter of hooves on cobblestone, the sharp smell of manure thick in the morning fog, and the constant chatter of thousands of lives brushing past one another, some rushing, some loafing, all jostling for space on narrow, winding roads that hadn't changed much since the Middle Ages. You glance down. You've just narrowly missed, stepping in something best not examined too closely. A man in a tall hat tips his brim to you before vanishing into the haze. Somewhere behind you, a street performer tunes a violin next to a bored horse hitched outside a wine shop. This is Paris, around 1830. And it is beautiful, but also absolutely disgusting. There's a reason people wrote so many poems about its light and laughter, because they were trying to forget how badly it smelled. And here's the thing, you probably wouldn't survive a single afternoon here. Not just because of the diseases, the fumes, or the rather cavalier attitude toward personal space, but because the city's early 19th century traffic situation was enough to crush your modern sensibilities flat, literally sometimes. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to drop your city and local time in the comments so we can all see who's falling asleep where tonight. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start your journey just as the fog begins to lift over the River Seine. Boats bob quietly in the harbor, but the streets are another matter. They're alive with chaos. Carriages piled high with crates and baskets careen past ragtag groups of street vendors. Pedestrians squeeze between carts, dodging the horses' unpredictable movements like it's a daily game of dodgeball, where everyone loses eventually. You pass an elegant woman in silk gloves trying to navigate a small sea of mud, with a lace handkerchief held bravely over her nose. A little boy runs by, barefoot, carrying a basket of bread loaves, while being chased by a shouting baker. Behind him, a loud splash, someone's just dumped a bucket of slop out a window. Again, in this city, movement was constant. But so was congestion. As many as 200,000 horses moved through Paris each day by the mid-1800s. Each horse could produce up to 30 pounds of manure daily. Now multiply that. That's 6 million pounds of waste, give or take, per day. It's less a traffic jam, and more a full-blown biological hazard. What's worse, horses were only the beginning. Paris was not yet a city of cars, certainly not of metros or smooth asphalt. It was a living relic built on winding medieval foundations, so narrow in places that two carts couldn't pass each other without scraping wheels and causing a shouting match. There were no traffic lights, no right-of-way rules, just a clamor of carts, wheelbarrows, wandering dogs, and the kind of yelling that would make a pirate blush. And this city was growing fast, thanks to the Industrial Revolution and the steady hum of progress. Paris's population nearly doubled. Between 1800 and 1850, that's hundreds of thousands more people, most of them crowding into the already swollen, sludgy neighborhoods. Sanitation, sparse, sidewalks, a dream, public toilets, practically non-existent. This brings us to a crucial element of daily life: bodily relief, specifically, the utter lack of anywhere to go. Picture this. You're out and about in Paris. Let's say you've just left your favorite café, where you had an unwise number of espressos. Suddenly nature calls. You look around. There are no restrooms, no Starbucks, no gas stations. What do? If you're a man, you probably just walk over to the side of a building and let it go. If you're a woman, well, historians still argue whether you held it, found an alley, or bribed your way into a shop. Probably a bit of everything, and none of it dignified. This wasn't just a social nuisance. It was a citywide crisis, because all that waste had to go somewhere. And until major sewer upgrades later in the century, most of it ended up in the streets. The smells mingled and multiplied. Horses, humans, garbage, fish guts, you name it. It mixed together into what many visitors described as a Parisian perfume, and not in a good way. Writers of the era recorded it all with a mixture of awe and nausea. Victor Hugo, for instance, described the city's underworld of sewage and shadow in Les Miserables, calling the sewers a conscience, which is poetic, but also, ooh. But this daily chaos had consequences far beyond smell. Traffic in Paris during this time wasn't just uncomfortable, was deadly. There were no speed limits, and drivers competed for space, like modern-day cabbies, with road rage. Pedestrian deaths were frequent. Injuries from falling into open cesspits, or being trampled by horses, were common enough to have their own euphemisms. It didn't help that early street lighting was dim at best. Oil lamps cast strange, flickering shadows. Gas lamps improved things slightly, but only in wealthier districts. And even then, fog, smoke, and general filth often made visibility poor. Imagine playing Frogger, but every level is set in a pea soup fog and ends with a wild stallion. Still, Parisians got on with it. They walked, they squished through it. They even found beauty in it, sometimes. Poets praised the chaos. Painters captured it in watercolor and soot. There's something about a city this alive in when it reeks, and somehow, out of this unruly mess, would come a strange, unexpected solution. One that would change not only the smell of Paris, but its traffic flow, its culture, even its design. A simple invention, standing quietly on a street corner. A public urinal. But not just any urinal. A scented one, yes, before the modern flush toilet. Before the concept of plumbing as we know it, Paris decided to solve its public pee crisis with a mix of ironwork and aromatherapy. But we'll get to that soon enough. For now, you take a deep breath, maybe to deep hand, continue strolling through the city's heaving aromatic boulevards. Somewhere a policeman tries to untangle a carriage jam. Somewhere else, a chimney sweep sings a tune, older than the revolution, and you try not to step in anything warm. You wake to the faint scent of freshly baked bread, laced, unfortunately, with a much stronger note of horse droppings. That's the perfume of progress in early 19th century Paris. You step cautiously onto the cobblestone street, where the sounds of city life are already echoing through the alleys. The clatter of hooves, the wooden rumble of wheels, and the indignant squawks of a goose who has somehow made it into the morning traffic jam. If you thought today's city driving was bad, you haven't tried getting across the Pont Neuf in 1832. Let's paint a picture. It's early morning. The sky is still a soft gray blue, and shopkeepers are just starting to open their shutters. But the street is already alive. Carriages jostle for position, pulled by horses that are impatient, strong-willed, and probably overdue for oats. The drivers shout loud, guttural, and deeply personal insults fly through the air as one coachman cuts off another. A vendor, pushing a cart of cabbages, swerves, narrowly avoiding a collision. A nun tugs two schoolchildren out of the path of a speeding delivery wagon. Somewhere behind you, there's a distinct splat. You don't turn around. It's easy to romanticize old Paris. The gas lamps, the accordion music, the lovers on bridges, but very few paintings show the sheer volume of manure blanketing the city at any given moment. Let's get numerical. As mentioned before, by mid-century, Paris had roughly 200,000 horses hauling people, goods, and everything else. Now your average horse drops somewhere between 15 to 30 pounds of waste per day. Do a little back-of-the-envelope math, and you're looking at 3 to 6 million pounds of manure every single day, and it wasn't swept up quickly. There wasn't a citywide sanitation department the way we think of today. Sure, some shopkeepers might clean the stoop in front of their store, but in most neighborhoods, piles of droppings just sat there, day after day, baking in the sun, mixing with rain, attracting flies, blocking wheels, the smell. Let's just say that the city's perfume industry was working overtime to compensate, and failing. But even beyond the stench and the slipperiness of the streets, there was something else happening, a massive transportation crisis that wasn't just about mess. It was about speed, direction, and volume. Because here's the fun part. There were no real traffic laws, none. Not until the late 1800s. You just drove, wherever. However, as long as your horse obeyed you, and even that wasn't guaranteed, you could charge down the road like it was your birthright. This led to an almost operatic level of street chaos. Coaches racing neck and neck for no reason. Wagons making wild left turns across crowded plazas. People yelling, horses spooking, and passengers white-knuckling their way to dinner parties. One British tourist in 1841 described a ride through Paris as equal parts exhilaration and terror, like descending a hill on a runaway cart made of wicker and spite. He also noted that his driver paused mid-ride to water the horses and himself. On the same curb, there was no horn honking, but there was shouting. Oh, the shouting. Parisian drivers had a rich vocabulary of curses, many of which could peel paint from the Arc de Triomphe. One favorite insult from the era roughly translates to, "I hope your wheels rot and your mare forgets you." A bit more poetic than modern road rage, but no less passionate, and pedestrians. You, dear sleeper, would have been considered barely more than moving obstacles. You didn't have crosswalks, or pedestrian zones, or traffic signals. You crossed where and when you could, usually by making eye contact with a driver and praying. Sometimes you'd grab the side of a slow-moving cart and hitch a ride across. Other times, you'd just run. Women in long dresses had to lift their skirts high above the muck, revealing boots and scandalous glimpses of ankle. Children were frequently dispatched on errands with instructions to avoid Rue Saint-Denis at all costs, due to the ever-present danger of being bowled over by a freight wagon, and heaven help the elderly. It wasn't all doom and dung. Some Parisians were surprisingly graceful amidst the chaos. You'd see flower sellers weaving through cartwheels like ballet dancers. Men with baskets balanced on poles across their shoulders walking with perfect poise. Dogs, yes, even dogs who knew exactly how to cross a street between carriages. Still, accidents were frequent and gruesome. Historical records from hospitals note hundreds of injuries from wagon-related collisions each year, ranging from crushed feet to broken backs. Many victims were children, but even adults weren't safe, because when a horse, spooked say from a sudden shout or an umbrella flapping in the wind, could bolt, and when it bolted, it took the carriage, cart, and every unlucky soul in its path with it. In one infamous case, a startled carriage went hurtling through the Place Vendôme, knocking over a full fruit stand, 3 market stalls, and a priest. The horse was eventually stopped by crashing into a fountain. The priest was unharmed but purportedly muttered, "Only in Paris," before walking off with a soggy hat. This wasn't just a public safety issue, it was bad for business. Deliveries were delayed. Shoppers avoided markets. Visitors from other cities found Paris overwhelming and occasionally disgusting. Something had to be done, but what? Paris couldn't function without horses. They were the lifeblood of trade and transport. You couldn't just stop people from moving, so instead, reformers began to think about infrastructure. Where were the bottlenecks? Which streets were worst? Could they make roads wider? Could they add sidewalks? Could they introduce rules? One of the earliest solutions was a network of regulators, men hired by the city to stand at intersections and direct traffic by hand. No whistles, no uniforms, just a tall stick and a lot of yelling. Unsurprisingly, these regulators were about as effective as shouting into the wind. By the 1840s, there were experiments with posting signs instructing drivers to go right or left, but with no enforcement, most ignored them. You'd see 2 wagons stuck in a standoff, both drivers refusing to yield, shouting insults as a queue formed behind them like a parade of frustration. It was in this context, a city buried in traffic, manure, and miscommunication, that Parisians began looking for small, practical fixes. Not just the grand redesigns of city planners, but tiny conveniences that might relieve pressure on the streets, reduce congestion, and most urgently help solve the human waste problem. Because one of the worst traffic slowdowns in the city came from men stopping to urinate. Yes, you read that correctly, with no public toilets. Men often relieved themselves in alleyways, corners, or even against trees. This wasn't just unsanitary, it blocked foot traffic, caused carriage backups, made pedestrians change course. Every man answering the call of nature became a tiny human traffic jam. Enter the public urinal. Known to Parisians as the PISSOIR. First, they were crude, wooden walls, no plumbing. often reeked worse than the alternative, but they worked. A man could quickly step off the main road, do his business, and rejoin the flow. Fewer alleyway peas, fewer sidewalk puddles, fewer interruptions, of course. They weren't universally loved. Many citizens called them indecent. Critics said they spoiled the city's beauty. Children used them as hiding spots. Dogs viewed them as competition. But slowly, over time, they became part of the landscape. And when engineers realized they could scent the urinals mask the odors, with oils, flowers, even vinegar tinctures, it was as if a strange dream had come true. A urinal that didn't smell like a urinal. In Paris, now that was revolutionary. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, you step aside as a barge-sized bread cart trundles past, the driver munching on an apple and cursing softly under his breath. You sidestep a fresh horse deposit, hop over a suspicious puddle, and pause beneath the shade of an awning that smells faintly of lavender. You take a deep breath and cough immediately. Paris, 1830s. The traffic may be unbearable, the poop piles may be high, but something's brewing, something sweet, something scented. You're standing on a Parisian street again, but this time something's shifted. The carts are still here, the horses still clip-clop over cobblestones. But looming on the horizon now is something monumental. A man, a figure, a force of history. No, not a new police officer trying to direct traffic though, that would help. We're talking about Napoleon Bonaparte, the self-declared Emperor of France, and the accidental father of many modern urban reforms. Now Napoleon isn't usually associated with street smells. He's more the battlefield tactics type, the crown myself at Notre Dame kind of guy. But what many people forget is, especially when lulled into sleeps, that Napoleon was obsessed with infrastructure, and more specifically, with the kind of order and clarity that might just bring some sense to a city where donkeys regularly collided with duchesses. Let's rewind. The year is 1800. Napoleon is just beginning his rise to power, still officially first consul, but already casting a long shadow over French politics. Paris is enormous, chaotic, and full of citizens who are grumpy about the revolution, the reign of terror, and most urgently the smell. And what Napoleon sees isn't just a city. He sees a problem, and he loves problems, especially the kind that can be solved with measurements, marble, and massive amounts of manpower. He looks at Paris the way someone might look at a closet that's never been organized, with horror and inspiration in equal parts. First off, the streets. The street grid of Paris wasn't a grid at all. It was a twisted mess of medieval cowpaths, alleyways, and lanes that were sometimes barely wide enough for two humans to pass each other without breathing into each other's faces. Napoleon was baffled. How can a modern empire have roads where people have to turn sideways to get to work? So he began to fix them. Not personally, of course, though the idea of Napoleon in a hard-it with a clipboard is oddly charming. He appointed people. He created departments. He allocated funding. His first move, street numbering. Yes, believe it or not, house numbers were not standard before Napoleon. You'd find your cousin's house by looking for the fifth door, after the butcher with the red awning, unless the awning had faded, in which case, you were out of luck. Napoleon decided this was unacceptable. Every building must have a number. Every street must be named. Every address must be legible to the military courier, the tax collector, and even the grumpy grandmother. The numbering wasn't perfect, Todd, and even sides weren't always consistent. But it was a start. Suddenly, letters arrived faster. Goods were delivered more efficiently. And, crucially, complaints about public urination could be logged with actual addresses. But numbering alone couldn't tame Paris. Napoleon turned next to the police, not just as enforcers of law, but as urban administrators. You see, before Napoleon, the police were mostly focused on catching pickpockets and breaking up fights. Napoleon gave them new orders: maintain cleanliness, regulate trade, inspect buildings, and monitor traffic flow. Suddenly you had officers tasked with managing how many wagons went down a street per hour. If that sounds like overkill, remember, when your city smells like a barn and everyone is shouting, overkill is the only kill. But even the most organized police force can't fix poor urban design. Which brings us to one of Napoleon's oddest and most visionary decisions. Cemeteries. Wait, don't fall asleep yet. This gets juicy. See, for centuries, Parisians had buried their dead in churchyards, in the middle of the city, in mass graves. Which sounds romantic until you realize that over time, those churchyards became so packed that bodies would rise up after heavy rains, and the stench. Well, let's just say it made the manure look like perfume. Napoleon decided this was unsustainable. He ordered the closure of inner-city graveyards, and moved many of the bones to what we now call the catacombs of Paris, a network of old stone quarries beneath the city, repurposed to hold millions of human remains. Yes, the bones were stacked like firewood. Yes, you can still visit them. No, it doesn't smell like roses. But here's the thing. This macabre act of burial realignment freed up public space, churchyards, were turned into parks. Open plazas emerged. Streets could be widened where crypts had once blocked expansion and traffic. It flowed just a little bit easier. Now, while all this is happening, Paris is still a city on the edge. The revolution had only just cooled down. People were cautious. Reform was welcome, but only if it didn't feel like tyranny in disguise. So Napoleon, cunning as ever, wrapped his infrastructure changes in the silk of civic pride. You weren't just getting a new sewer system, you were joining the empire's march toward glory. You weren't losing your shortcut alley. You were gaining a monumentally more efficient postal route. And you weren't just seeing fewer puddles of questionable origin. You were living in a cleaner, smarter, modern city. But the horse poop, still there. Because no matter how wide the boulevards got, or how well numbered the buildings were, there were still tens of thousands of animals on the streets. Every delivery, every guest arriving at a dinner party, every sack of flour from Normandy, all of it, came by hoof. And hoofs have needs. This led to the rise of the horse maintenance economy. Farriers, stable boys, oat merchants, brush sellers. An entire subclass of workers emerged just to keep the city's equine population healthy and moving. But guess what? Wasn't prioritized. Waste removal. Napoleon had ideas. But he didn't get around to solving the poop. His engineers were more focused on aqueducts and bridges, not shovels and scoops. The result? Streets that were wider, and still gross. The good news? Napoleon was laying groundwork. Later generations would pick up where he left off. Enter baronial bulldozers. But we're not there yet. Let's linger with Napoleon just a bit longer. There's a great story, possibly apocryphal, of Napoleon taking a moonlight ride through Paris in a small carriage. He's said to have stopped at a particularly narrow corner where 3 carts were stuck in a standoff, each driver refusing to reverse. The emperor observed the scene for a moment, then muttered something like, "This city cannot win wars if it cannot solve a left turn." Historians still argue whether this happened. Some say it's a myth. Others think Napoleon probably did grumble about intersections, but maybe not in quite such poetic terms. What's undeniable is that he saw urban dysfunction as a threat to national power. And that made him one of the earliest leaders to link infrastructure to imperial ambition. And yes, he did care about smell sort. Napoleon was famously he wore cologne, constantly violet, lavender, orange blossom. He supposedly used so much of it that Josephine could smell him before she saw him. His personal hygiene, better than average for the time, though his soldiers still teased him for having a perfume budget larger than our boots. Did he connect this olfactory obsession to city planning? Probably not directly. But it's no stretch to say his desire for clean, well-ordered cities was tied to a personal sense of presentation and control. For Napoleon, appearances mattered. A filthy capital was a weak capital. So while he may not have built the scented urinals himself, he helped create the administrative momentum that would eventually lead Paris there. That, and the grudging acceptance that maybe, just maybe, rules could improve a city. And with that thought, you stroll down one of Napoleon's newly widened boulevards. The gas lamps flicker gently above your head. A passing carriage doesn't nearly run you over for once. And there, in the distance, you catch a whiff, not manure this time, but something sweet. Maybe lilac, maybe lemon oil, maybe progress. You're standing on a Parisian street again, but this time something's shifted. The carts are still here, the horses still clip-clop over cobblestones. But looming on the horizon now is something monumental. A man, a figure, a force of history. No, not a new police officer trying to direct traffic, though that would help. We're talking about Napoleon Bonaparte, the self-declared Emperor of France, and the accidental father of many modern urban reforms. Now, Napoleon isn't usually associated with street smells. He's more the battlefield tactics type, the crown myself at Notre Dame kind of guy. But what many people forget, especially when lulled into sleep, is that Napoleon was obsessed with infrastructure, and more specifically, with a kind of order and clarity that might just bring some sense to a city where donkeys regularly collided with duchesses. Let's rewind. The year is 1800. Napoleon is just beginning his rise to power, still officially first consul, but already casting a long shadow over French politics. Paris is enormous, chaotic, and full of citizens who are grumpy about the revolution, the reign of terror, and most urgently the smell. And what Napoleon sees isn't just a city. He sees a problem, and he loves problems, especially the kind that can be solved with measurements, marble, and massive amounts of manpower. He looks at Paris the way someone might look at a closet that's never been organized, with horror and inspiration in equal parts. First off, the streets. The street grid of Paris wasn't a grid at all. It was a twisted mess of medieval cowpaths, alleyways, and lanes that were sometimes barely wide enough for two humans to pass each other without breathing into each other's faces. Napoleon was baffled. How can a modern empire have roads where people have to turn sideways to get to work? So he began to fix them. Not personally, of course, though the idea of Napoleon in a hard-out with a clipboard is oddly charming. He appointed people. He created departments. He allocated funding. His first move: street numbering. Yes, believe it or not, house numbers were not standard before Napoleon. You'd find your cousin's house by looking for the fifth door after the butcher with the red awning. Unless the awning had faded, in which case you were out of luck. Napoleon decided this was unacceptable. Every building must have a number. Every street must be named. Every address must be legible to the military courier, the tax collector, and even the grumpy grandmother. The numbering wasn't perfect, and even sides weren't always consistent. But it was a start. Suddenly, letters arrived faster. Goods were delivered more efficiently, and, crucially, complaints about public urination could be logged with actual addresses. But numbering alone couldn't tame Paris. Napoleon turned next to the police, not just as enforcers of law, but as urban administrators. You see, before Napoleon, the police were mostly focused on catching pickpockets and breaking up fights. Napoleon gave them new orders: maintain cleanliness, regulate trade, inspect buildings, and monitor traffic flow. Suddenly, you had officers tasked with managing how many wagons went down a street per hour. If that sounds like overkill, remember, when your city smells like a barn and everyone is shouting, overkill is the only kill. But even the most organized police force can't fix poor urban design. Which brings us to one of Napoleon's oldest and most visionary decisions: cemeteries. Wait, don't fall asleep yet. This gets juicy. See, for centuries, Parisians had buried their dead in churchyards, in the middle of the city, in mass graves. Which sounds romantic until you realize that over time, those churchyards became so packed that bodies would rise up after heavy rains. And the stench, well, let's just say it made the manure look like perfume. Napoleon decided this was unsustainable. He ordered the closure of inner-city graveyards, and moved many of the bones to what we now call the catacombs of Paris, a network of old stone quarries beneath the city, repurposed to hold millions of human remains. Yes, the bones were stacked like firewood. Yes, you can still visit them. No, it doesn't smell like roses. But here's the thing. This macabre act of burial realignment freed up public space. Churchyards were turned into parks. Open plazas emerged. Streets could be widened where crypts had once blocked expansion and traffic. It flowed just a little bit easier. Now, while all this is happening, Paris is still a city on the edge. The revolution had only just cooled down. People were cautious. Reform was welcome, but only if it didn't feel like tyranny in disguise. So, Napoleon, cunning as ever, wrapped his infrastructure changes in the silk of civic pride. You weren't just getting a new sewer system, you were joining the empire's march toward glory. You weren't losing your shortcut alley, you were gaining a monumentally more efficient postal route. And you weren't just seeing fewer puddles of questionable origin. We're living in a cleaner, smarter, modern city. But the horse poop, still there, because no matter how wide the boulevards got, or how well numbered the buildings were, there were still tens of thousands of animals on the streets. Every delivery, every guest arriving at a dinner party, every sack of flour from Normandy, all of it, came by hoof. And hoofs have needs. This led to the rise of the horse maintenance economy. Farriers, stable boys, oat merchants, brush sellers, an entire subclass of workers emerged just to keep the city's equine population healthy and moving. But guess what wasn't prioritized? Waste removal. Napoleon had ideas, but he didn't get around to solving the poop. His engineers were more focused on aqueducts and bridges, not shovels and scoops. The result? Streets that were wider, and still gross. The good news. Napoleon was laying groundwork. Later generations would pick up where he left off. Enter baronial bulldozers, but we're not there yet. Let's linger with Napoleon just a bit longer. There's a great story, possibly apocryphal, of Napoleon taking a moonlight ride through Paris in a small carriage. He's said to have stopped at a particularly narrow corner where 3 carts were stuck in a standoff, each driver refusing to reverse. The emperor observed the scene for a moment, then muttered something like, "This city cannot win wars if it cannot solve a left turn." Historians still argue whether this happened. Some say it's a myth. Others think Napoleon probably did grumble about intersections, but maybe not in quite such poetic terms. What's undeniable is that he saw urban dysfunction as a threat to national power. And that made him one of the earliest leaders to link infrastructure to imperial ambition. And yes, he did care about smell sort. Of Napoleon was famously sent. He wore cologne, constantly violet, lavender, orange blossom. He supposedly used so much of it that Josephine could smell him before she saw him. His personal hygiene, better than average for the time, though his soldiers still teased him for having a perfume budget larger than our boots. Did he connect this olfactory obsession to city planning? Probably not directly, but it's no stretch to say his desire for clean, well-odored cities was tied to a personal sense of presentation and control. For Napoleon, appearances mattered. A filthy capital was a weak capital. So while he may not have built the scented urinals himself, he helped create the administrative momentum that would eventually lead Paris there. That, and the grudging acceptance, that maybe, just maybe, rules could improve a city. And with that thought, you stroll down one of Napoleon's newly widened boulevards. The gas lamps flicker gently above your head. A passing carriage doesn't nearly run you over for once. And there, in the distance, you catch a whiff, not manure this time, but something sweet, maybe lilac, maybe lemon oil, maybe agresse. You're walking now down one of Paris's older cobblestone lanes, narrow, uneven, and filled with little dips that collect water, or what used to be water. In truth, what's pooled here is a thin, oily, yellowish liquid that smells like a combination of rotting cabbage, rusty nails, and someone's abandoned dinner plate from 3 weeks ago. And that's on a good day. The year is somewhere around 1840. And these puddles are more than just ice pores. In this era of miasma theory, people believe that disease wafts invisibly through tainted air. Puddles like these are urban death traps. You step around them instinctively, as if they could lunge up and grab your ankle. Because, well, sometimes they kind of do. You see, Paris is still without a proper stormwater drainage system. So when it rains, everything washes into the streets, not just water from the sky, but waste from the alleys. Blood from the slaughterhouses, suds from the laundresses, ashes from the chimneys, and worse, from the hundreds of thousands of residents, who still relieve themselves wherever they can. That little brown trickle running beside the bakery. Not a spilled latte. You might think the solution would be simple. Build gutters, lay pipes, cover the drains. But Paris is a strange beast. Its layout is tangled, its terrain uneven, and its population growing at a rate that would make any modern urban planner sob into their blueprint. Remember, this is a city where your upstairs neighbor might empty their chamber pot out the window with nothing more than a warning yell, "Gare low." Watch out for the water. You learn quickly to walk close to the buildings, under awnings, preferably with a hat. Now picture this, a warm summer morning. The streets are baking. The sun is rising, and with it, the smell. The puddles you sidestepped last night have fermented. They're bubbling slightly. That's not just water anymore, it's alive. Historians still argue whether this was the point at which Parisians began demanding real change, or whether they simply became numb to the odor. Some reports from travelers at the time described the city as an olfactory battlefield, while others insisted that after 3 days, you barely noticed. But what you do notice is how the smells begin to shape the rhythms of the city. Street vendors adjust their schedules to avoid the heat of the day. Butchers carve meat in the early morning when flies are fewer. Fishmongers shout louder in the afternoon to sell their stock before it turns. Perfume shops do brisk business just before dusk. Everyone needs a little courage before heading out for the evening stroll. And there, on the boulevard, something else is taking shape. A new kind of public awareness. Newspapers begin printing columns about hygienic catastrophes. Citizens write letters to the city council demanding cleaner streets. Cartoonists mock politicians by drawing them with clothespins on their noses. There's even a popular satirical poem that begins, "Paris is a rose that smells of regret, and through it all, that sticky, slow death puddle near your boot remains, glinting in the light. Now, let's walk into a public marketer, Les Halles, or a Marché des Enfants Rouges. The air is heavy with the smell of cheese, fruit, fish, and overripe produce. But there's another scent here, too, humanity. Sweat, smoke, stale breath. A pickpocket brushes past you, and you realize they smell better than the fishmonger. Markets are the lifeblood of Parisian daily life in this period, and they're also prime zones of stink accumulation. No refrigeration, minimal ventilation, and waste disposal consists of sweeping rotten goods into the gutter at the end of the day. If it rains, it sloshes back toward the stalls. If it's dry, it bakes into a crunchy paste. People try to fight back. Sand is spread on some streets to absorb liquid waste. Lime powder is tossed into alleyways to neutralize odors. Some wealthy citizens even hire their own private street sweepers to clear the way before their morning walks. But it's not enough. Especially not when the sun heats the city like a kettle left on the boil. One doctor of the time, a particularly poetic soul, wrote, "The puddles of Paris are shallow graves for the lungs." His name was Dr. Auguste Mignard, and he was one of the first physicians to propose that if smells could kill, then smells could also be mapped, measured, and perhaps treated. He proposed what he called the odor topography of Paris, a scent-based map that categorized neighborhoods by their level of foulness. It was never officially adopted, but scholars still debate whether it inspired future sanitation planning. You can imagine the legend, can't you? Zone 1, mild cheese and candle wax. Zone 5, strong urine with notes of despair. Meanwhile, businesses took matters into their own hands. Cafés and salons began burning scented wood chips at the entrance. Some even handed out little nosecloths soaked in lavender water. You'd walk in, nod politely, and press the cloth to your nose like a nobleman in a plague painting. And then, finally, the puddles became political. During the 1848 revolution, brief and chaotic moment of barricades, bread riots, and broken promises, one of the rebel demands was actually cleaner water and streets. Amid cries for liberty and wages, citizens were shouting about sewers. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The city was sick, and unless it was cleaned from the gutters up, nothing else could change. It would take another decade before real transformation began, but the smell of protest had already been aired. And so here you are, standing at the edge of yet another glistening puddle, watching as a man in a top hat carefully hops over it with a grimace. You both know it's not just water. You both pretend not to know. And somewhere, down in the shadows of the cobblestones, Something stirs the early rumblings of reform. Because when puddles start to appear on government agendas, you know something is shifting. And so, dear listener, you tiptoe on, careful where you step. The city may not yet be clean, but something is in the air besides the smell, that is. You've been walking the streets of 1840s Paris for quite a while now. Your shoes are sticky with who knows what, and your nostrils have reluctantly signed a ceasefire with the air around you. But nature calls and, not just metaphorically, you desperately need to relieve yourself. If you're a man, you're in luck. Sort of. You turn the corner and spot what looks like a tall, decorative column made of cast iron, standing on a stone base with an odd open flap and a small shielded partition on one side. It's subtly tucked beside a row of poplar trees, painted a dull forest green, with ornate vines worked into the iron like someone genuinely cared how this thing looked. This, dear listener, is a urinoir, in its full and glorious French, a colonne urinaire, a public urinal. Elegant, semi-open, unapologetically French. But don't imagine a restroom with walls, lights, or privacy. These were essentially metal boxes that allowed one to discreetly pee while standing upon the street. No flushing, no water, no just you, the iron shield, and the quiet dignity of pretending not to notice the steam rising in cold weather. Historians still argue whether the first official urinoir was installed in 1834 or a few years later, but what's certain is that they were part of a slow, smell-driven revolution in public hygiene. Napoleon Bonaparte's earlier attempts at civic reform had emphasized order, cleanliness, and civic pride. The idea was simple. If you give people somewhere to go, maybe they won't go everywhere else. You'd think this innovation would be immediately beloved. It was practical, it addressed an obvious issue, and it was even decorated with artistic flair. But no, the public was divided. Why? Well, first, there was the issue of modesty. Some Parisians felt these iron booths encouraged indecency. After all, the men using them were still visible from the waist up. And while it was better than peeing directly onto someone's carriage wheel, it still wasn't the image of refinement the city liked to project. Second, they stank. These urinals didn't flush. They just accumulated. The city hired workers, often poor, marginalized laborers, to empty and rinse them manually, usually at night. It was dirty work, and dangerous too. Exposure to ammonia fumes, disease, and public mockery was part of the job. Third, and perhaps most ironically, some Parisians missed the old ways. Writers complained that the romance of the city was being ironed out literally, that the wild, chaotic, ped-drenched charm of old Paris was being replaced by cold civic engineering. One poet compared the new urinals to metal mushrooms sprouting from the sidewalks, each one fed by the sadness of a man's bladder. Yet, for all the criticism, the urinoirs multiplied. Slowly, steadily, dozens became hundreds. The most popular model was called the Vespasian, named after the Roman Emperor Vespasian, who imposed a tax on public urine collection. True story. Collected urine for tanning leather. The French admired that entrepreneurial touch. Now, picture this. A chilly Parisian morning. Mist curling off the Seine. A man in a black overcoat stops at a Vespasian beside a lamppost. He leans in. Business is conducted quickly. He adjusts his gloves and strolls off. Behind him, a cloud of scent lingers, but it's not all unpleasant. The city has started to experiment with perfumes. Yes, you heard that right. In a stroke of olfactory genius, or perhaps desperation, Paris began adding scent diffusers to some public urinals. Lavender, pine oil, lemon peel. It didn't eliminate the smell, but it did mask it enough that locals began calling certain urinoirs the colognes of the gutter. There's even a documented account of a perfumer's apprentice who would sneak into the cleaning crews at night, adding experimental fragrances and keeping notes. His diary, found decades later, includes such gems as rose, ineffective; sandalwood, made people hungrier, oddly; mint, encouraging, might cause lingering. But perhaps the most fascinating thing about this whole urinal affair is how it reshaped urban behavior. Suddenly, men didn't have to sneak into alleyways or behind market stalls. They could use the urinoir and returned to their business like civilized citizens. Cafés reported fewer incidents of patrons using the back garden wall. Shopkeepers stopped having to hose down their storefronts every morning, and the city noticed. More importantly, women noticed, and not kindly, because the elegant urinoir revolution was for men only. There were no equivalent facilities for women, not even a poor imitation. The city's planners, almost all male, decided women didn't need them, that ladies would simply wait until they were home, or visit a café, where restrooms often weren't available either. This gender gap became a sore point among Parisian feminists and writers. The satirical magazine Le Chivalry once ran a cartoon showing a woman dressed as a man, hat pulled low, sneaking into a urinoir. The caption read, "Equality requires boldness and trousers." Historians still debate whether this lack of public facilities played a subtle role in the slow radicalization of urban women. One activist famously declared, "A city that denies my bladder denies my humanity." But let's pull back for a moment. All this, the iron columns, the scented vents, the political cartoons, arose from a simple, unspeakable fact. Paris had a pee problem, and solving it required not just architecture and labor, but art, argument, and a level of civic negotiation that most governments reserve for taxes or trade deals. In that sense, the Vespasian is more than a urinal. It's a monument to compromise. And now, as you stand beside one in the 1860s twilight, watching the gaslights flicker on and hearing the distant clatter of horseshoes on stone, you can feel it. The city is learning to live with its smell, at least shape them into something almost tolerable. The next phase of transformation won't just be about where people relieve themselves. It'll be about where that waste goes, what infrastructure carries it, and what that says about the soul of a city. But that's for the next walk. For now, you tighten your scarf, breathe in the oddly floral night air, and stroll on. You wander deeper into 19th century Paris, nose cautiously tilted to the wind, as if hoping the air might deliver some early warning. You've already grown used to the contradictory mix of progress and putrescence, of wrought iron and eau de sewage. But now the city has something new in store. Or rather, in scent. Because this is the era when Paris, embarrassed by its stench, decided to do the only thing more dramatic than hiding it, fighting it with fragrance. Yes, friend, welcome to the oddly serious and, occasionally hilarious history of scent engineering. Let's start with a dilemma. By the 1860s, the city's public urinals, or Vespasians, were multiplying like pigeons. And while they helped reduce random peeing on statues, carts, and church steps, they didn't exactly win awards for aroma. Add to that the fact that the sewer system was still half finished, and that horse dung, open-air butchers, tanneries, and unwashed citizens were all doing their aromatic worst. And you had a situation so pungent, poets wrote about it. One newspaper article from 1865 described Paris as perfumed like a chamber pot left in the sun, then sprinkled with rosewater out of spite. That's where the concept of scent engineering took root. City planners, perfumers, and even chemists began to imagine a world where public spaces could be treated like salons, delicately fragranced, artfully masked. If you can't eliminate the source, they reasoned, distract the nose. The first experiments were modest. Lavender sachets placed near urinals, pine oil drops added to gutter water. Little carts rolled through the streets spraying vinegar mist, which was supposed to neutralize odors, though it mostly just made things smell like salad. But Paris doesn't stay modest for long. Soon, scent became an aesthetic project. The city commissioned certain perfumers, often with ties to luxury houses, to develop fragrance blends specifically for public spaces. The result? Street-grade perfumes, designed not to charm, but to survive. One famous concoction was called Eau de Barricade, an aggressive citrus spice blend, sprayed near government buildings and police stations. Another was Le Vent de Souterrain, the underground wind, a bizarre mixture of clove, pine tar, and mint that was drizzled into sewer grates. The idea was that, if enough scented oil drifted downward, it would rise back up as perfumed air. It didn't quite work. In fact, historians still argue whether any of this did. Some say the scents simply mingled with the smells and made things worse, creating a heady brew of feces and flowers that assaulted passersby with contradictory signals. Others insist that the psychological effect was real, that even a faint suggestion of lavender tricked the brain into tolerate otherwise unbearable stenches. You pass a Vespasian, now there's one newer, decorated with fluted Corinthian columns and boasting a little plaque, maintained with eau de heliotrope. You're not sure what heliotrope smells like, but you admire the effort. It's the equivalent of putting a tuxedo on a goat and insisting it's now appropriate for dinner parties. And yet, Paris kept trying. Entire scent zones were created. Around theaters and opera houses, floral blends reigned. Jasmine, rose, lily of the valley. Around the slaughterhouses of La Villette, heavier notes dominated. Cedarwood, tobacco, leather, anything to compete with the scent of blood. In wealthy neighborhoods like the Marais, citizens petitioned for their own blend, demanding that their streets be perfumed to match their social rank. Even the newly constructed underground sewers weren't spared. In 1867, during the Paris Exposition Universelle, visitors were allowed to tour sections of the sewer system via boat. And you'll never guess how the city prepared. They perfumed the sewers. That's right. They poured barrels of mint and citrus oils into the waste streams before the royal visit, hoping to convince dignitaries that Paris was not just modern, it was fragrant. Newspapers described the experience as oddly refreshing and not at all like wading through a graveyard for soup. But perhaps the strangest moment came in 1871 during the Paris Commune. In the middle of revolutionary street warfare, someone, not a general, not a politician, but a sanitation officer, wrote an urgent note to his superiors. It read, "Amid chaos, the Rue Saint-Antoine smells of decay and unemptied piss. The barricades are bearable. The air is not. The solution: perfume bombs. Crude grenades filled not with explosives, but with pressurized citrus oil, were tossed into alleyways and barricaded streets. A few exploded properly. Most just leaked. One brave communard allegedly threw one back, shouting, 'Your lemons shall not cleanse our revolution.'" Historians still debate whether this story is true, apocryphal, or the product of a satirical paper trying to make the Parisians smell a little less self-important. Either way, it reveals something essential about the moment. Smell was political, and here's where you pause. Because, as silly as it sounds, aromatic weapons, scented sewers, perfumed urinals, this entire episode tells a deeper story. One of a city trying to control its identity through its air. Paris wanted to smell like romance, intellect, art, not filth. And instead of removing the sources of stench, it tried to overwhelm them with fantasy. Which brings you, nose first, to the modern field of environmental fragrance design. Today, hotels, casinos, and even shopping malls use scent engineering to guide emotion. Ever wondered why every lush store smells like a candy shop? Or why high-end hotels often have a consistent fragrance across all their properties? It started here, in the urinals, in the lavender-laced gutters of 19th century Paris. So now, as you stand near the corner of Rue Montorgueil, you take a deep breath. The air smells faintly of soap, rain, and the ghost of jasmine long vanished. It might not be the cleanest city in the world, but it's trying to be the most imaginative about its stink. And for a city that once perfumed its battle zones, that's not nothing. You're still walking. You've followed the perfumed urinals and the lavender-sprayed gutters, and now the sun has dropped behind the rooftops. Gas lamps hiss to life one by one, and the golden mist of 19th century Paris begins to soften into its famous nocturne glow. But the night doesn't only awaken music and love letters. It awakens, the barrelmen. You probably haven't heard of them. Or if you have, you might think they're the stuff of some grim fairy tale, like chimney sweeps or organ grinders. But no, these were very real men with very real barrels, and they had one of the most essential, revolting, and oddly dignified jobs in the city: collecting human waste. You glance down a side alley, and there they are, moving slowly, carefully, carrying what looks like wooden drums on their backs, some round, some square, all battered with years of grime. These are les vidangers, or more colloquially, les bouaux, literally, the muddy ones. And muddy they are. Their job? To go from home to home, building to building, and empty the night soil, that polite euphemism for the buckets and chamber pots filled during the day and night by thousands of Parisians who didn't have indoor plumbing, you see. Despite all the reforms and all the iron urinals and scented grates, most homes in Paris still didn't have toilets, especially the working-class tenements and overcrowded boarding houses. For most people, the routine was simple. Squat, relieve yourself in the chamber pot, and tuck it away beneath the bed or into a corner. If you were polite, you covered it. If you were in a hurry, you didn't. And then, come nightfall, the barrelmen arrived. They'd clomp up the stairs, often in pairs, hoisting sloshing barrels and rope systems to haul up full containers and replace them with empty ones. The smell was beyond description. The danger was real. Many wore thick leather aprons and soaked cloths over their mouths. Some carried small pouches of herbs they stuffed into their nostrils like modern Vicks. But the pay was decent. And more importantly, the job was essential. In fact, there's a strange reverence in the way old newspapers describe them. One editor called them the secret custodians of the city's sanity. Another, less kindly, called them the night ghouls with golden shoulders, a reference to the reflective strips some wore. Historians still argue whether these men were seen more as heroes or nuisances. But one thing is clear: without them, Paris would have drowned in its own filth. Now, imagine the rhythm of their work every evening. Hundreds of men fanning out across the neighborhoods, each one with a route, each one with a list. They knew the names of the buildings, the quirks of the tenants. They knew which chamber pots were heavier than they should be, and which households tried to sneak in garbage, dead animals, or even old shoes into the mix. Yes, really. One vidanger's notes from 1870 list 3 boots, a dead chicken, and what may have been a wig. And what happened to all that waste? Ah, here comes the moonlit mystery. The barrels were carted, mostly at night, to designated dump sites outside the city. There, depending on the era and the policy of the day, the contents might be dumped into shallow pits and buried, sold as fertilizer to nearby farms. Yes, human waste was once considered black gold or, unfortunately, just dumped into the Seine, especially during floods or when politics interfered. The very river where lovers strolled and painters dipped their brushes was also a part-time open sewer. You won't see that in the postcards. There's even an account from 1852, describing a particularly large waste dump near Montmartre, that after a heat wave, became so pungent it was felt before it was seen. But still, the system worked barely, and this is where things get weirder. Because sometimes, the barrelmen couldn't make it in time. Or they were on strike, not uncommon. Or perhaps the tenant didn't want to pay. And when that happened, Paris reverted to an older tradition, the midnight toss. You hear it before you see it. A soft squeak. A clatter of wood. A voice calling out, "Gare, allo, watch out for the water." And then, a splash. Someone, from a window above, has emptied their chamber pot directly into the street. It was technically illegal. It was certainly impolite. But it was deeply embedded in the culture. Children learned the phrase, "Gare à l'eau," before they could read. It was the medieval equivalent of shouting, "for." On a golf course, except what followed wasn't a golf ball. Sometimes people ignored the warning and got soaked. Sometimes fights broke out. One 1873 police record describes a man hitting another with a loaf of bread in retaliation for an unexpected dousing, and still, the ritual continued. You can picture it now, can't you? The amber glow of a gaslight. A narrow cobbled street. A shutter creaks open 3 stories up. A voice calls out, and the contents of a porcelain pot arc gracefully into the air, glinting for just a second before gravity claims it. This was Paris, a city both beautiful and disgusting, refined and raw. It wore perfume at its temples and filth on its shoes. But not forever. Because, as the 19th century rolled on, something massive was stirring beneath the feet of Parisians. A network of tunnels, pipes, valves, and basins. A system that would eventually remove the need for barrelmen, chamber pots, Then midnight tosses dot the modern sewer system. And if you keep walking just a little longer, just a few more blocks into the flickering night, you might hear the sound of it, not the smell, but the slow thunder of water below, carving its way toward civilization. But for now, you rest. You find a quiet bench. The barrelmen pass by, grunting, nodding, vanishing into the fog. The air smells, tolerable, maybe even clean. Just don't sit too close to the gutter. You've made it this far dodging chamber pots, navigating past perfumed pissoirs, and tiptoeing around the legacy of the barrelmen. But now, as you continue through this creaky, dimly gaslit city, you begin to notice something different, something far more subtle. It tickles your nose instead of assaulting it. It's not exactly a clean smell, but it's intentional, floral, musky, sharp, earthy. And it tells you something important. Paris is fighting back, not with swords, not with laws, but with perfume. Yes, by the mid-19th century, the city of light was quietly becoming the city of scent. The perfume industry had existed in France for centuries. Of course, but now, for the first time, it was being deployed not just for beauty and luxury, but as an urban weapon. You see, for most Parisians, especially in the first half of the 1800s, daily life was full of smell-based decisions. Whether to walk down one alley or another, whether to sit on this bench or that stoop, whether to enter a bakery, or flee past a butcher shop on a hot day. Smell wasn't just sensory, it was survival, and the perfume houses of Paris saw opportunity in that. As you walk past a row of shops, some closed, others still lit, you can almost imagine them, elegant storefronts, with gilded signs bearing names like Lubin, Guerlain, Halbigen. These weren't just shops. They were laboratories of olfactory hope. Jean-Louis Chin, Marie Antoinette's perfumer, had once created fragrances inspired by Versailles gardens. But now, newer perfumers were concocting blends to do something more practical. Mask Paris itself. Picture the task. How do you design a perfume strong enough to stand up to rotting meat, sewage mist, sweaty corsets, horse droppings, and the ghost of fish left too long in the sun? It wasn't easy, so perfumers got creative. They began experimenting with combinations of ambergris, civet, musk, jasmine, patchouli, lavender, oakmoss, and even bituminous tartu, anchor their scents and give them staying power. Guerlain's famous Eau de Cologne Impériale, released in Iba-Wu-Sen for Empress Eugenie, was so potent that a single dab could waft over several feet and linger for hours. And if you're thinking, wait, weren't these fragrances expensive? Yes, they were. But here's where it gets more interesting. Perfume wasn't just for people. It was being used on buildings, fountains, streets, even the air. In 1867, the city tried a curious experiment. In one arrondissement, lamplighters were instructed to place scented cloths inside gas lanterns. When the lamps heated up, the scent would slowly release perfumed light, if you can believe it. The experiment didn't last long. Turns out musk and open flames don't mix. But the idea was bold. Hospitals, fearing disease spread by miasmas, began burning herbs, pouring rosewater over tiles, and hanging sachets of crushed lavender from ceilings. Even the urinals got in on the act. Remember those pissoirs from earlier sections? Some were retrofitted with little trays filled with scented chalk, pine resin, or even burnt coffee grounds. Anything to cut the funk. And yes, there were failures. One over-enthusiastic doctor suggested a prototype that involved perfuming water mains, so that every public fountain in Paris would smell like violets. It worked, briefly. Then the water began to smell like rotting violets, and the plan was shelved indefinitely. Still, the scent offensive had begun, and not everyone was pleased. Some Parisians, especially the older crowd, saw the rise of perfume as a sign of decline. If the air must lie to us, one cranky columnist wrote in 1862, then how shall we ever trust our own noses again? Historians still argue whether perfume culture was a triumph of sanitation or a tragic olfactory cover-up. Was the scented veil a victory against filth, or just a gilded distraction? You sit on a bench near the Seine, surrounded by the sweet musk of history. And consider both sides. The city certainly smelled better, but it also began to believe it smelled better. And belief, in this case, could be dangerous, because if the nose was fooled, perhaps the eyes could be too. Maybe a city that smelled clean didn't feel the urgency to be clean. This philosophical tension ran deep. It whispered through pamphlets, bubbled up in salons, and even crept into literature. Balzac and Zola wrote about characters overwhelmed by fake sweetness, by manufactured pleasantness masking moral decay. The scent of flowers on a brothel windowsill, the lavender in a dying man's room, the perfume-soaked collar of a murderer. You shift in your seat. The air changes. A breeze comes off the river, carrying with it not perfume, but something else more honest, damp, stone, iron, maybe fish, maybe mildew. It's not terrible, it's just Paris. And maybe that's the point. The perfume industry wasn't trying to destroy the city's soul, it was trying to save it, one drop at a time. Each bottle, each vial, a tiny rebellion against entropy, against rot, against time. The same way cathedrals defied the sky, and sewer tunnels tamed the earth. Perfume tamed the air. And while the barrelmen trudged below, and the pissoirs whispered in their zinc, the perfumers worked in silence, blending molecules, boiling petals, distilling defiance into bottles no bigger than your palm. You pass one now, on your late-night walk, a perfumery still lit. The clerk leans on the counter, drowsy but upright. You step closer and catch a hint of something jasmine, amber, hope, or maybe it's just memory. You exhale, deeper this time. Paris is quiet again. You wake up the next morning not because you were sleeping, you weren't, but because Paris is starting to stir again. The baker down the street opens early. The smell of yeast and wood smoke weaves its way up narrow alleys. A milk cart rumbles by, and in the distance, over rooftops not yet covered in soot for the day, a new kind of Paris is coming into view. This isn't the Paris of slippery cobbles, stink-riddled pissoirs, or perfumed illusions. No, this is a Paris under construction, a city dreaming of straight lines, gleaming boulevards. And imagine this: sidewalks wide enough that two people can walk without touching elbows. And standing atop it all is one man, Baron Georges Eugene Haussmann. You've probably heard the name, maybe in passing, maybe from a plaque on a wall or a line in a guidebook. But unless you're an architecture student or a very committed urban planner, you probably haven't realized that this man single-handedly reshaped the city you're walking through, and not gently, either. Let's take a stroll through his mind, shall we? You find yourself in 1853. Paris is messy, chaotic, and embarrassingly outdated. It's still a medieval maze of alleys and dung, and despaired with perfume trying its best to keep up. Emperor Napoleon III, newly in power, decides Paris must transform. He doesn't want just a cleaner city, he wants a modern empire of order. A gleaming jewel that reflects France's global ambitions. And who better to lead that transformation than a Prussian-born, ruthlessly organized bureaucrat named Haussmann? From the moment he's appointed prefect of the Seine, Haussmann gets to work not with a broom, but with a blueprint. And not just one or two new streets. He draws plans for an entirely new Paris. You walk a little faster now, because around you, in this imaginary version of the city, walls are coming down. Medieval houses, some older than Columbus, are being demolished, whole neighborhoods scraped from the map. The scale is almost unthinkable. Over 60% of the buildings in central Paris will be torn down or rebuilt under Haussmann's rule. And it's not random. Haussmann wants airflow, light, movement. He carves new boulevards wide enough for carriages to turn around and soldiers to march 5 abreast. And yes, that was intentional. You can't rebel in a city if every street gives the army room to gallop in. He adds parks, sewage canals, and an underground aqueduct network so elaborate that some Parisians start calling it a second city beneath the city. You pass a work site, hundreds of men in wool coats and muddy boots, hauling stone. Horses strain under carts. Women peer out windows, watching their homes disappear one wall at a time. Children run through clouds of dust. Paris right now is ugly with purpose, but with change comes resistance. Historians still argue whether Haussmann was a genius or a tyrant. On the one hand, he transformed a dying city into the model of urban modernity. On the other, he displaced thousands of families, flattened working-class districts, and created a two-tiered city beauty up front, poverty pushed to the margins. You walk past one of the wide tree-lined avenues, now glowing under the morning sun. It's stunning. Uniform cream-colored buildings, identical balconies, black iron railings, but behind them, still sometimes, the old city hides. Cellars that date back to the 1400s. Hidden alleys too narrow for horses. The echo of a life that didn't make the blueprint. And what about the smell? That was part of the plan. Haussmann didn't just want the city to look clean. He wanted it to breathe. The new sewer systems, based on models from London but made even bigger, flushed waste faster than ever before. Wide streets meant fewer shadows, more wind, and crucially less lingering filth. Water ran cleaner, and public urinals, upgraded and modernized, were now part of a broader hygiene infrastructure. In some districts, the old Castier and pissoirs were replaced with newer models, sleek, ventilated, and even more scented, and more accessible. They were placed at the intersection of new boulevards, often facing flower stalls or fountains, so the smell of lilies or roses could sneak past the stink. You pass one now, a Haussmann era urinal still standing. It's almost pretty, if you squint. Decorative ironwork curls around its side. Inside it's tiled, a modest privacy screen, and just above the bowl, a small slot filled with ... What's that? Scented cedar shavings. Still refilled, even now. You lean in, not too close. Just enough to catch a faint whiff of lemon oil and soap. Someone, somewhere, still maintains the old ways. You walk on. What fascinates you most, though, is how Haussmann's vision reached beyond the nose. This wasn't just urban hygiene, it was social engineering. By laying out the city in straight, organized lines, he was trying to reorganize the people themselves. Cleanliness as discipline, order as morality, scent as control. He created a Paris where the rich lived in view, and the poor were tucked out of sight, often pushed to the new suburbs where the boulevards did not go. Some scholars still debate whether Haussmann's design made Paris safer, or simply more polite on the surface. He was eventually dismissed, not for the violence of his vision, but because he spent a ludicrous amount of money doing it. Billions, in today's terms. And when Napoleon III fell from power, Haussmann's enemies came for him. But the city remained. The streets he drew, the parks he planted, the sewers he buried, all still there. You turn the corner. The Avenue de l'Opéra stretches before you like a dream. Straight, silent, impossibly grand. The buildings match. The lampposts stand like soldiers. The air smells faintly of stone, warmed by sun, and even though it's early, people are out. Couples walking, vendors setting up. A boy chases a hoop with a stick, laughing as it clatters along the new, even pavement. You close your eyes. The city hums, clean, ordered, breezy. But behind it all, you remember the chaos it came from. The stinking alleys, the riot-prone corners, the scented piss wars fighting an endless war with human waste. Haussmann didn't win that war. Not entirely, but he changed the battlefield forever. You stay up longer than you expected. The city doesn't really sleep, it hums, even when it's dark. But now, under flickering gaslight, something peculiar begins to stir in the foggy blue before dawn. It's subtle at first. You hear the distant clatter of a broom, the wheeze of old iron wheels, and the occasional sploosh of water hitting cobblestone. You step out again. It's still Paris. Still the wide boulevards and perfumed shadows of Haussmann's making. But this part of the night has a rhythm all its own. And it starts with a man carrying a lantern and a mop. He's not alone. He's one of hundreds of early morning street sweepers, or balayeurs, whose job was not just to clean, but to prepare the city for waking up. Their shift starts before the baker even stretches. With a long-handled broom made from birch bristles, he moves deliberately, sweeping not just dust but the remains of an entire day, horse manure, spilled wine, crumpled letters, peach pits, and the occasional broken heel from someone who partied too hard. And you follow him. Because this part of the city is alive with a different kind of energy. Not noisy, not frantic, but focused. Paris has, in a way, turned into a backstage crew, tidying the set before the curtain rises again. Back in the early milieu de Saint-Assisi, before Haussmann's redesigned Parisian streets were a nightmare of grime, the gutters ran through the middle of the street, meaning that everything human waste, dead rats, fish guts from the markets flowed right where people walked. Ladies lifted their skirts, men leaped puddles. Everyone tried not to breathe too deeply, but as public health ideas grew stronger, especially with the rise of miasma theory, the belief that disease was spread through bad air, cleaning the city became an emergency, not just an aesthetic. And so began the early rise of municipal cleaning crews, a new kind of civic pride. You weren't just making the streets less slippery, you were saving lives. Fast forward to the 1860s, and you'd find cleaning crews armed with more than just brooms. Haussmann's new sewers included hydrant-accessible water channels, which allowed workers to flush entire boulevards. It was like washing your living room by turning on a tap. Water would gush into side gutters, and sweepers would guide the flow with their brooms, pushing refuse toward drains like silent conductors in a soggy orchestra. You watch them now, silent, shadows with sashes around their waists, boots caked in old mud. Some smoke pipes as they work, others hum. One begins to whistle, a tune you almost recognize, a lullaby perhaps, or a patriotic march played at half speed. But the star of the show, the water carts. Imagine a giant wooden barrel mounted on two thick iron wheels. A spout juts from the bottom. It's pulled by a single-tired horse, and operated by a man who looks like he's been cleaning streets since Napoleon was still in short pants. As the cart rolls, a lever opens the valve, and a gush of water floods the curbside, clearing away yesterday's sins. You notice something else. The water, smells nice, not floral, but sharper. Herbal. It takes a moment, but you realize it's pine oil, added to the cleaning mix to keep streets not only clean, but olfactorily pleasant. In fact, by the 1880s, scented street flushing had become a citywide protocol. Peppermint, pine, and even lavender oils were sometimes added, not in every arrondissement, mind you, but certainly in the more elite quarters. A boulevard bath, if you will. Historians still argue whether this effort was more for the noses of aristocrats or the lungs of the poor, but regardless, the result was the same. Parisians began associating the smell of pine with morning, with freshness, with order returning after night. There's a moment, here quiet and reflective. You pass a corner cafe, just unlocking its shutters. The cleaning crew nods to the baker, who hands them dialed bread as thanks. A kind of mutual rhythm exists here. The ones who clean, and the ones who wake. But not everyone approved of the system. Some conservative writers, at the time especially in provincial newspapers, complained that Paris was becoming too clean, that it was sanitizing its soul, that the charm of the city, with its chaotic gutters and wild smells, was being bleached out by civic pride. Others wrote satirical poems about the morning sweepers, calling them the rain that walks upright. You chuckle at that. As you continue your walk, you notice something even more elaborate. In certain upscale neighborhoods, like the newly laid-out Champs-Élysées, the city hired scent dispersers, workers whose job was to carry small canisters of herbal vinegar and gently mist the public benches and urinals as part of their morning rounds. It sounds absurd, but these vinegar men, as they were called, were genuinely believed to repel disease through the power of sharp, clean aroma. Imagine someone wandering the city with a spray bottle of minty pickling solution, dabbing it onto stonework with priestly precision, and yet it worked, at least symbolically. You reach the banks of the Seine now. Even here, early workers sweep along the stone paths, clearing pigeon feathers and leaves. A vendor sets up chairs. Another washes fruit in a bucket. And down the river, barges are beginning to deliver fresh goods, fish, flowers, all floating into a city, newly scrubbed. For morning, it's easy to think all this cleaning is normal. But remember, Paris wasn't always this way. The ritual of cleaning the city overnight was hard-won, built from epidemics, revolts, and centuries of odor-induced trauma. And the irony, even with all this effort, people still peed in alleys. Drunks, still stumbled into gutters. Horses still did what horses do. The morning cleanup was never a complete erasure, was a reset, a deep breath before the next day's chaos. You stop for a moment, look back at the street you just walked, where there had been grime. Now there is shimmer. Where there had been garbage. Now only the faintest outline remains, and where there had been stench, you breathe in faint pine, lavender, vinegar, ... and, perhaps something else. The ghost of a city still trying after all these centuries to smell like itself. You're now standing in the quieter part of the city. An older arrondissement, where the trees lean over narrow streets and shutters still creak with the wind. The sun is rising slowly, brushing cream-colored facades with gold. But your focus shifts away from the beauty. You've been walking for a while now, sipping weak café au lait from a paper cup, and well, nature calls. It's here that your journey takes a more relieving turn. You glance around for a sign. Not a shop or a café, but one of those peculiar little structures that seem half lamppost, half metal booth. Yes, there it is. A Vespacentha, famous Parisian public urinal, designed specifically for gentlemen on the go. And believe it or not, this modest invention once symbolized a radical shift in how cities managed human dignity. Let's step into history. Back in the early 1800s, Paris had a serious urination problem, not due to some epidemic or a faulty sewer system, but rather due to the sheer volume of public emissions made without a moment's shame. Men relieved themselves wherever they pleased, against buildings, in alleys, under bridges, behind churches, and sometimes, with galling indifference, right in the middle of the street. There's even a 19th century joke that Paris smelled like poetry and piss, equal parts romance and rankness. You'd walk a few steps, and there it would be, a puddle, a stain, a suspicious steam rising in winter. The stench, chronic, pervasive. Legendary. As Paris grew more crowded during the 19th century, so too did the volume of public urination. At the time, there were few formal alternatives. Toilets inside homes were a luxury, and even cafés didn't always provide facilities. The poor and, often the not-so-poor, simply used the city as a toilet. It was unhygienic, it was foul, and according to many moralists of the time, it was downright uncivilized. Something had to change. Enter Claude Philibert Barthelot, Count de Rambaud, prefect of the Seine from 1833 to 1848. He was a planner, a reformer, a man who genuinely believed cities could be elegant, clean, and orderly. Rambaud was the kind of man who would lose sleep over the placement of a sewer grate or the crooked angle of a lamppost. And when he turned his attention to Paris's sanitation, he introduced a strange and brilliant solution: public urinals, but not just any public urinals. Rambaud envisioned dignified, architecturally conscious street features, functional yet elegant structures that would offer privacy and prevent embarrassment. These were the first true Vespasians, named rather cheekily after the Roman Emperor Vespasian, who famously taxed public urinals in ancient Rome and justified it with the phrase, pecunia non allet, money doesn't stink. By 1834, the first model was installed. It looked like a cylindrical green kiosk, open at the back, with privacy shields and a modest basin. From the outside, it resembled a cross between a telephone booth and a flower stand, subtle, practical, and frankly, a bit charming. You walk up to one now. It's vintage cast iron with intricate detailing, like a miniature rotunda. A small tin sign above the door reads, "Pour Messieurs Soulement, for gentlemen only." You notice the curved interior metal half-wall that lets you enter and exit with minimal exposure. There's no door, just discretion. And here's the odd part: it doesn't smell. Why? Because the Vespasians of the late 19th century were designed with ventilation systems, waste capture pipes, and yes, perfumed disinfectants. The city actually employed workers whose job it was to clean and scent these urinals daily, using pine oil, vinegar, and sometimes citrus peel solutions. They weren't just toilets, they were a performance of order. But not everyone was impressed. Some Parisians, especially conservatives and clergy, found the urinals obscene. Imagine the scandal of placing urinals on every corner of a fashionable boulevard. They claimed it encouraged laziness, indecency, and even immorality. After all, wasn't it unseemly for men to relieve themselves within earshot of a cathedral? Then again, the alternative was worse. Before the Vespasian, there was the pot de chambre, a chamber pot often dumped from windows with a careless shout of "Guard, alo! Watch out below." Streets were slick with the city's secrets. Rambuteau's urinals were an attempt not just to clean up Paris physically, but morally and aesthetically. And they caught on. By the 1850s, there were dozens. By 1900, there were over 1,200 Vespasians across Paris. Some were simple pillars. Others were elaborate multi-stall versions, with iron fretwork and gaslighting. Some even had tiny roofed domes and artwork. Yes, there were urinals with Art Nouveau flair. You stroll past one now that looks like a garden trellis. Ivy climbs up its side. A pigeon has perched on the rim. And inside, a man whistles softly, as if to say, "Bonjour, civic infrastructure." But here's the catch. Despite their ubiquity, the Vespasians had a major flaw. They were only for women. They were expected to wait, or hold it, or retreat into the shadows of cafés, and ask, politely, and often shamefully, to use the facilities. The city offered no parallel for ladies, until much later, and even then, the designs were awkward, dangerous, and often discouraged. Many early feminists saw this as symbolic. Men could be public bodies. Women had to remain private ones. Historians still argue whether this was a matter of infrastructure or ideology. Were women excluded for safety reasons, or simply ignored? Some scholars suggest it was both a reflection of how cities themselves were built to serve the male pedestrian. But today, as you walk through these quieter, early morning streets, the Vespasian remains a relic of both progress and prejudice. A green ghost of Paris's attempt to make dignity public. And the irony, most of them are gone. In the 1980s, Paris began replacing its Vespasians with automated, unisex toilet pods, metallic capsules that clean themselves after every use. The old cast-iron stalls were too costly to maintain, and more importantly too gender-specific for modern sensibilities. You walk by one now. Sleek, round, a button blinks green. A robotic voice welcomes you in French. It's functional, sanitary, efficient, but it lacks the charm. You look back at the vintage Vespasian, weathered, ivy-covered, quietly dignified. It may no longer work, but it says something about a time when even public urination was part of the city's grand performance. You laugh quietly to yourself, only in Paris. You think, would a toilet have a legacy? You're now strolling through Paris, but not the cheerful Paris of morning markets and flirtatious café chatter. No, this is a different Paris. A tense Paris, one draped in fog and shadow. The year is 1917. The war rages on. The streets are darker, quieter, and edged with anxiety. But the Vespasians, still standing, still serving. Still sacred. Use single quotes. You'd expect wartime to strip away everything non-essential comforts, culture, the little architectural flourishes that make a city feel like itself. But here's a curious truth. In many cases, the urinals stayed. Not just as utilities, but as quiet symbols of civilian resilience. You find one near Gare de l'Est. It's worn, painted dark to avoid catching light from air raids, but still functional. You can picture soldiers on leave, some just boys, really using it before catching a train to the front. Or maybe after returning, ghosts behind their eyes, desperate for small rituals that remind them they're human. There's a strange dignity to it, that something so basic, so bodily could also be a link to normalcy. And here's the twist. During World War I, and later World War II, public urinals became minor, yet critical parts of wartime urban planning. Let's pull back a bit. The logistics of war are about more than ammunition and battle plans. They include food, fuel, Moreland, yes, sanitation. Armies and governments quickly learned that when basic hygiene breaks down, entire populations get sick, disoriented, and demoralized. In the trenches, it meant trench foot and dysentery. In the cities, it meant cholera, typhoid, and social unrest. So, municipal officials, especially in cities like Paris and London, began to reprioritize public toilets, including urinals, as public health stabilizers. Think about that. A urinal as a morale tool. But it worked. During WWI, French newspapers occasionally praised the upkeep of Parisian urinals, noting how even as bombs fell, a gentleman could find relief with dignity. That sounds absurd now, but back then, the symbolism mattered. Holding on to small comforts in a world of chaos was, in itself, an act of defiance. And it wasn't just men on the street. Soldiers returning on short leave passes from the front mud-caked, half-starved, shell-shocked would often head straight for the Vespasian, not just to relieve themselves, but to perform a ritual of re-entry into civilian life. Imagine the feeling. Stepping from the hell of Verdun, or the Somme, still shaking from the constant whistle of shells, and finding a quiet corner of the city, with clean tile, a familiar design, and perhaps even a spritz of disinfectant lemon oil. It's not about the urinal. It's about the world it reminds you of. Historians still debate whether this emotional response to the Vespasians was intentionally designed or merely accidental. Did urban planners really think of them as emotional anchors? Or were they simply practical tools, elevated in meaning only because of the stress of the times? Whatever the case, by World War II, the symbolic value of Paris's urinals was even clearer. When the Nazis occupied the city in 1940, they didn't dismantle the urinals. Some historians think it was part of the propaganda push keeping the streets clean, the lights dim, and the air civilized, an illusion of normal life. In other words, yes, we've taken your country, but look, your toilets are still functional. You might laugh, but the psychology is fascinating. In fact, there are scattered reports, half legend, half confirmed, of resistance fighters using Vespasians as secret drop points. Tucked behind the privacy screens, messages were hidden, weapons exchanged, notes passed to contacts. The urinal became a camouflage of sorts, what soldier or spy would think to search a public pissoir. It's wartime Paris, after all, the last place anyone wants to loiter. And then, of course, there's the dark humor. One famous anecdote tells of a resistance cell using a Vespasian near Rue de Rivoli to deliver false intelligence. They'd leave notes behind the grate marked for Uncle Marcel. German soldiers never figured out that Uncle Marcel was the code name for a British contact. One SS officer apparently complained that no city smells as proudly defiant as this one. You grin. That's Paris for you. Even when conquered, it fights back with style and a little mischief. Now let's shift slightly. Not all public urinals in wartime were so poetic. As rationing set in, so did scarcity. Cleaning supplies grew limited. Maintenance staff were conscripted or displaced. Many Vespasians fell into disrepair, but rather than being removed, they were simply left to rot still standing. Increasingly foul, but also oddly dignified, like aging aristocrats left behind in a bombed-out salon. You walk past one now. Rust creeps along the frame, paint peels, like old wallpaper. Yet still, someone perhaps last night relieved themselves there. It still serves. It still holds its purpose. Perhaps that's the most Parisian thing of all. What surprises you most, though, is how civilian diaries from this period mention the Vespasians, not in disgust, but in nostalgia. One entry from a schoolteacher in 1943 reads, "Past the green urinal near Boulevard Haussmann, still there, still working. I stopped just to wash my hands. Strange, the comfort it brought me." Another, from a seamstress, "They haven't cleaned it in weeks. But I don't care, it smells like home." It makes you pause. In a world reduced to rubble and ration cards, even a neglected urinal could be a thread tying the soul to something resembling the past. Paris's Vespasians weren't immune to propaganda, either. By the late 1940s, pro-Allied posters appeared. In or near urinals, liberators wash their hands. Or use your freedom, cleanly liberas mais proprement. Again, the toilet becomes not just a tool, but a stage, a place to act out identity, allegiance, and dignity. You wouldn't have guessed it this morning, sipping coffee and tracing your walk through sleepy streets. But standing here now, beside this aging green relic, you realize you're looking at a monument. Not to war, or empire, or revolution, but to something subtler, something stubborn. The city's refusal to give up its small civilities. It's a kind of victory, isn't it? You're moving slower now. The cobblestones feel gentler beneath your feet, almost like they're cushioning each step. Paris breathes softer in the early evening, and you find yourself passing by another one of those green cast iron urinals, except this one smells oddly pleasant. Like a whisper of lavender, floating through stale rainwater and history. Unexpected, but not unpleasant. Here's something wild. At the turn of the 20th century, Paris actually had a commission on public olfaction. Their job, to regulate how the city smelled. That's right, you're not hallucinating from sleepiness. There were actual city officials whose job was to sniff the streets, because by 1900, smell had become political. Let's zoom out for a second. Industrial cities like Paris, London, and New York were booming. That meant factories, coal smoke, horse dung, sewage, and thousands of people packed into tighter spaces. With all that came a rising awareness and fear of smell. People began associating odor, not just with discomfort, but with disease, class, and even morality. In Paris, this manifested in an unlikely place, the Vespa, SIENN. By now, you know these urinals were more than just a place to pee. But you may not realize just how much social meaning was packed into the smell of one. If a urinal reeked, it wasn't just gross, it was symbolic. It meant the city was slipping, that civility was cracking, that the thin, perfumed veil of bourgeois decency was wearing thin. So, naturally, the municipal authorities stepped in with perfume. Historians still argue whether the shift to scented urinals came from the health department or from pressure by aristocratic neighborhoods, but by 1905, Paris began to experiment with odor-masking strategies. And here's the kicker. They used actual Chanel prototypes. Before Coco Chanel became a fashion icon, her perfumers dabbled in large-scale scent solutions, including industrial applications. One little-known fragrance, developed by her chemist Ernest Bauze, was designed to be atomized into Parisian Vespasians through tiny brass nozzles. You chuckle, imagining this perfumer being told, "Yes, Ernest, it's perfect for wrists and necks, but can you make it stick to the inside of a pist tube?" It worked, kind of. The scent was delicate, floral, and surprisingly complex. Within days, Le Figaro noted that public urinals in the Marais now welcomed the citizen with a smile of violets. But not everyone was pleased. Some believed that adding fragrance to filth was dishonest, covering up decay rather than fixing it. A symbolic perfume over real problems. Thinkers like Georges Bataille and the Surrealists even wrote small essays about the hypocrisy of the perfumed poorhouse. You pause and breathe deep. Could a city really be judged by how it chooses to mask its own decay? But let's not get too cynical, because for many Parisians, the scented urinals became a point of pride, especially for the working class, who had few spaces of refinement. Suddenly, they had access to an amenity that at least briefly smelled like something out of a boutique. Here's an odd historical footnote. In 1911, a municipal election was partially swayed by scented urinals. A young reformist candidate, named Jules Fournier, ran on the slogan, "For a fresher Paris." It was a wink to both sanitation and class dignity. And yes, he won. His first act in office, expanding the fragrance program to include 5 rotating scents: citrus, pine, violet, musk, and something called amber nuaya. Mysterious blend, said to include ambergris and rose. Every arrondissement had its own assigned scent rotation, and one of Fournier's campaign promises was to ensure that even the poorest quartiers could enjoy equal access to fragrant relief. You grin again. Democratized perfume through public urinals. If nothing else, you have to admire the commitment to equality. And it went deeper. Perfume suppliers began lobbying city council for contracts. Fragrance houses began tailoring formulas not for skin, but for ceramic and brass. One company even advertised their new scent with the slogan, "So good, it could make a urinal romantic." Was it a joke? Maybe. But people bought it. In fact, Some bought too much of it. By 1923, there were reports of local teens stealing the scent cartridges from urinals and dabbing them behind their ears. Perfume theft became a low-key problem. With Le Petit Parisien warning readers, "Do not apply scent designed for steel pipes to human flesh. It's surreal." But that's the thing about history. It doesn't have to make sense to be real. Historians still debate how effective this scented urinal initiative truly was. Did it actually reduce the stench, or merely mix flowery smells with urine into something more confusing than pleasant? Was this a meaningful sanitation advance, or just aromatic theater? Whatever your stance, the result was clear. Parisians now talked about smell politically, and they began noticing it everywhere. Artists like Marcel Duchamp began including urinals and toilet motifs in their work, not just to provoke, but to comment on class, cleanliness, and decay. Duchamp's famous piece, Fountain of Plain Porcelain Urinal, turned into high art, can be seen as a sarcastic nod to Paris's scented sanitation efforts. Even literature got in on it. In a 1931 novel by Colette, the main character describes her neighborhood by how each urinal smells during the week. Monday, lemon. Wednesday, tobacco musk. Friday, just sadness. Poetic, bizarre, and yet strangely accurate. You can't help but feel a kind of reverence for the weird, sensual intimacy people had with their city. They knew its smells, its moods, its rituals. A walk through Paris was never just visual, it was olfactory. And thanks to those ridiculous, noble little Vespasians, even the act of urination became part of a cultural ballet. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, imagine yourself as part of that strange dance. You step into an ivy-draped corner alcove. A soft perfume wafts upward. The iron feels cool under your fingertips. You lean forward, not with haste, but with ease. The moment is private, but not lonely. Around you, the city moves, sighs, breathes, remembers, and for just a second, the air smells like violets. You're walking now through a quieter part of the city. The sun has dipped just low enough to cast long shadows, stretching like lazy cats across the stone pathways. A gust of wind brushes your cheek and carries something unexpected. Not the musk of urine or the bite of coal smoke, but something sweet, a floral trace. Someone passed this way, and they left a whisper behind. Maybe it's lavender, or neroli, or jasmine, carried from the scarf of a woman with somewhere to be. And that's where we begin tonight, you see. While Paris was refining the science of smell and rethinking sanitation through city planning and scented urinals, something else was simmering on the fringes. A quiet revolt led by women, not in the revolutionary, storming the Bastille sense. No guillotines tonight. Just velvet gloves, clever steps, and perfume bottles clutched like weapons. Let's talk about the women who between 1880 and 1930 reclaimed public space through smell, visibility, and quiet civil disobedience. The late 19th century wasn't kind to women in public. Respectable ladies were expected to be discreet, invisible, tucked away in private salons and drawing rooms. Streets were for men particularly, cafés, newspapers, politics, and yes, those very Vespasians. But women? No, no. If you were out and about too freely, people raised their eyebrows. A woman lingering in public risked being labeled as no matter her station. And yet, thousands of women had no choice. Working-class women textile workers, laundresses, seamstresses, food vendors had to move through the city to survive. They had bodies' needs, places to be. And guess what wasn't available to them? Public toilets. The urinals of Paris, those glorious green, clanking inventions were for men only. There was no equivalent for women until well into the 20th century, which meant a lady had three choices. Hold it, pay for access to a cafe restroom, or find a dark alley and pray. And into this absurd gap stepped something surprising. Perfume. Historians still debate who first realized it, but sometime in the 1890s. Parisian women began using strong floral perfumes not just for fashion, but as a tool of resistance, spraying themselves heavily before navigating public markets or long streetcar rides marking space, demanding olfactory presence. There's a delicious irony here. Men had the city's official scented urinals, while women made themselves the scent. One little-known memoir from 1903 describes a laundress named Edith, who carried a small vial of orange blossom oil around her neck. She would reapply every 2 hours while walking from the wash-house to the river, she said, to remind the city that I, too, am allowed to be smelled. You smile at the phrase allowed to be smelled. It says so much, doesn't it? It wasn't just about hygiene. It was about visibility. About announcing, I am here. I belong. Upper-class women caught on. Slowly, the use of overpowering personal perfume shifted from being vulgar to being a sign of boldness, of confidence, of agency. Still, there was pushback. Newspapers began running editorials about scent aggression, accusing women of weaponizing fragrance in close quarters. One even asked, must a tramcar become a Turkish harem? As if scent itself were some exotic threat, displacing the right of men to breathe clean air. But women didn't stop. In fact, they turned it up by 1910. Perfume shops in Montmartre were advertising street blends, specifically crafted mixes that were long-lasting, sharp, and made to carry across sidewalks. One famous blend, La Marcheuse the Walker, was described as having notes of tuberose, sandalwood, and defiance. Yes, defiance was literally in the description. That same year, feminist journals began discussing scent in political terms. One article in La Fronde, a women-run newspaper, argued, if men own the streets with iron and stone, we shall answer with roses and nerve. It wasn't just theory. Some women took things further. In 1911, during a protest for equal wages, women marched through the Rue de Rivoli, holding handkerchiefs soaked in jasmine oil. As police approached, they waved their scarves like flags not in fear, but in flourish. One journalist later wrote that the scent lingered longer than the outrage. Another charming story. Josephine Peen, a tobacconist's daughter turned activist, began handing out small spritzers of violet water at women's gatherings. Her reasoning, if they won't give us space, we will make space smell like us. So simple, so genius. This all may sound quaint to modern ears, but at the time, these gestures carried weight. To wear perfume openly, strongly, without apologies was to say, I have a body. It moves, it takes up space, and you can't ignore it. Remember, these were women who weren't even legally allowed to vote yet, who needed their husband's permission to open a bank account, and yet here they were. Taking ownership of the air itself, the effects rippled beyond smell. Urban designers began receiving letters from women asking for benches near flower beds, for footpaths near perfumeries, for toilet stalls that didn't require a purchase. Bit by bit, the city began to shift. And let's not forget the power of gossip, as perfume became a tool of public presence. Women whispered about scent formulas like they once whispered about corsets. They swapped recipes, shared sources. Some even began mixing their own blends at home, using crushed rose petals, clove, lemon peels, and brandy. You imagine them now, standing in small kitchens, boiling petals, staining fingers, reclaiming something quiet and powerful. Historians still argue whether this was true protest or poetic rebellion. But does it matter? The impact is tangible. Because by the 1920s, Parisians of every class had grown used to women's scent in public. It was part of the sensory map of the city. The same way bells marked the hour, or wheels clattered on cobbles, perfume was now a soundless assertion. Tonight, as you lie back and drift further into slumber, you think of those women walking through alleys, market stalls, and tramcars leaving trails of tuberose, jasmine, and stubborn grace in their wake. They never asked for permission. And Paris, in time, learned to breathe with them. You're strolling again this time along the banks of the Seine, where the evening breeze ripples through chestnut trees and rustles. Stray pages in the hands of readers perched on stone ledges. A boat hums in the distance, gliding past the Pont Neuf, but your eyes are on the riverbank stalls that line the walkway, those faded green boxes, all hinged lids and peeling paint. These, of course, are the bouquinist, second-hand booksellers who have hawked literature, philosophy, poetry, and pulp along the Parisian riversides for over 2 centuries. But tonight, They're not just quirky tourist charm. Tonight, they are our entry point into an absurd, fragrant, and very French battle over public space. Because, while urinals were being planted across Paris like stubborn mushrooms, other parts of the sidewalk were being fiercely negotiated by bakers, barbers, bookmen, flower sellers, and yes, baguette-carrying pedestrians. You might not think a loaf of bread or a cart of used books could lead to revolution, but in 19th century Paris, even a baguette had a politics. Let's rewind just a bit. By the 1850s, Baron Haussmann's grand renovations had already transformed the city. Wide boulevards replaced cramped medieval lanes. Uniform building facades gleamed with new limestone. And everything from tree spacing to sewer grates was designed to look orderly. But no plan survives contact with Parisians, because the people who actually lived in the city weren't about to give up their time-honored traditions just for symmetry. And so began the slow, awkward dance of reclaiming space. One sidewalk at a time. The first problem: vendors. Market sellers didn't just vanish because indoor markets were built. Many preferred the streets. You'd see a fishmonger haggling over carp just steps away from a florist wrapping violets with yesterday's newspaper, and their stalls spilled everywhere onto walkways, across alleys, sometimes blocking café chairs or leading to polite yelling matches involving celery. The bouquinists were a particularly bold bunch. Officially, they weren't supposed to have permanent stalls. The city only allowed temporary setups just a few hours a day, but by the 1860s, they started pushing back. Some simply left their boxers in place overnight. Others chained them to railings. One particularly stubborn seller known only as Claude the Lame cemented his box to the pavement and dared officials to remove it. They tried, the box cracked, but Claude replaced it with a new one, bolted deeper into the ground. He told a reporter, "If Haussmann can dig up Paris, so can I." Historians still argue whether these bouquinist rebellions were organized resistance or just stubborn entrepreneurship. Either way, they worked. By 1891, the city formally recognized the right of bouquinists to operate year-round, with permanent boxes and even decorative guidelines. Of course, with books taking over the railings, other vendors got jealous. Bakers, for instance, were furious the rise of the sidewalk book trade meant less room for food carts and open-air sandwich stands. Some bakers accused bouquinists of blocking access to bakery doors. One famously hung a sign reading, "If you can't read, you may as well eat." Meanwhile, pedestrians were caught in the middle, especially women in crinolines trying to squeeze between an open bookstall and a pile of oysters. That brings us to one of the oddest compromises in Parisian history: the law of the 80-centimeter path, passed in 1902. This law required all sidewalk vendors, bookmen, florists, even musicians too, leave at least 80 centimeters of clear walking space for pedestrians. Not 79. Not 81. Exactly 80. City inspectors, equipped with measuring sticks, would patrol the Seine and randomly check if your table or crate violated this precious corridor. Did this solve the problem? Not quite. Vendors got clever, but began angling their boxers just enough to pass inspection. Bakers started offering portable baguettes, wrapped in napkins for walk-handed snacking. Flower sellers tied their bouquets vertically to poles to avoid taking up sidewalk width. And in the middle of it all, stood the Vespasians, those urinals. Suddenly, these green metal half-circles were seen as unfair. Why? People asked. Should public urine get real estate, while books and flowers are told to scram? The city responded by announcing a bizarre new rule: urinals must also obey the 80-centimeter law. The press had a field day. One satirical newspaper ran a headline: "Inspector finds a man for peeing too broadly." Another suggested urinals be put on wheels so they may roll with the people's will. This was also the moment when public benches became battlegrounds. Some Parisians wanted more benches, especially near urinals. "Give us a place to rest after relief," one woman wrote to the mayor. But vendors opposed benches. They took up valuable sales space. One bouquinist referred to benches as horizontal freeloaders. Cafés got involved too. You might think the great Parisian café is a symbol of leisure and philosophy. But during this era, Cafés began aggressively expanding their sidewalks, seating trying to squeeze in too. Sometimes 3 rows of tables, and the worst offender, chairs chained to pipes. That's right. To avoid city inspections, some cafés would chain their chairs to sewer pipes or lampposts, overnight claiming they were fixtures, not furniture. City officials were not amused. In 1907, one councilman sarcastically suggested installing foldable citizens, who could simply collapse when sidewalk space got tight. Then there was the Great Bread Cart Crisis of 1913. With the price of wheat fluctuating and baguettes becoming slightly longer, bakers began delivering loaves in extended carts, some over 2 meters wide. Suddenly, a single bread cart could block an entire block. After a particularly dramatic incident in Montparnasse, where a cart got wedged between a bookstall and a cafe awning, a temporary moratorium on wide bread carts was issued. Newspapers called it the Battle of the Baguette Boulevard. Through all this, you might wonder, was any of this about sanitation anymore? Not really, but the scent still lingered. Literally, remember, Paris had scented urinals, wafting violet and pine into the street. Florists naturally fought back. One planted an entire mobile jasmine garden in a wheelbarrow, parked it beside a particularly smelly Vespasian, and charged passersby a single sou for a whiff of something better. Children nicknamed it the nose wagon. Eventually, the city had to accept that sidewalk space in Paris was not neutral ground. It was political, cultural, emotional. People didn't just walk through the streets, they performed in them, argued on them, ate on them, read on them, and yes, relieved themselves. One city planner in 1922 wrote, "Sidewalks are our true stages. The play changes daily, the actors hourly, but the scent, that lingers. And now, as your feet slow, and the imaginary cobbles beneath your step begin to blur, you pass one last bouquinist box, the lid closed, the lock rusted, a tiny sticker on the side reading 80 centimeters, or bust. You smile. Because tonight, even in sleep, you've walked the old sidewalks of Paris book in hand. Baguette underarm, dodging chairs, dodging carts, and tracing the trail of jasmine-scented protest, and all you really wanted was some space to walk. You don't expect to be hit with it so soon, not after everything you've smelled already tonight. But as you wander into the 1870s Paris streets again, the aroma arrives like a whispered rumor. Violet, not fresh violet, not the kind that grows in a spring meadow. This is industrial violetta, perfumed puff baked into hot iron, clinging to the air like memory. And whether you know it or not, chassé by, you've just walked into one of the earliest experiments in scent branding. Long before international corporations were using signature perfumes to lure customers or create identities, 19th century Paris tried something wildly odd and unintentionally pioneering. It began using perfume as public policy. Let's step back and set the mood. It's 1873. France is reeling from political chaos, a war with Prussia, and the smoldering embers of the Paris Commune. But ordinary Parisians are just trying to live. They walk the new boulevards, read their morning fettings, sip thick coffee, and unfortunately get a big noseful of public urinals every few blocks. Remember those green, crescent-shaped vests? At this point, they number in the hundreds, scattered across arrondissements like punctuation. Their function, clear. Their form, iconic. Their smell, complicated. Even with all the ventilation designs and slanted zinc floors, these things reeked. By noon on a warm day, you could sniff a Vespasian from across the street. People started to complain. Not just passersby, but local shopkeepers, street musicians, even the police. One bakery owner wrote to City Hall, "You cannot expect me to sell eclairs under a bouquet of ammonia." So the city did something drastic. It turned to the perfume industry. That perfume industry, the powdered wigs, the glass flacons, the royal courtiers. Except now, they were being asked to fight the stench of modernity by scenting the sewers. Enter parfum public no. 1. This was a mix of violet essence, cedar oil, pine, and something vaguely described as medicinal spirit. It was poured into special copper chambers inside select Vespasians, where rising heat would carry it through grates and out into the air. The idea: if you couldn't remove the smell, mask it. And more than that, make the scent memorable. Make people associate relief with something gentle, pleasant, almost domestic. Parisians were skeptical at first. Some called it perfumed denial. Others joked that the city was just trying to turn piss into poetry. But slowly, something happened. A few cafés noticed that tables near the newly scented urinals saw more traffic. People started recognizing certain corners by their smell. Go past the violet one, then take a right. Someone might say it got weirder. Children gave the urinals nicknames based on the perfume: the lavender lion, the minty moon, the cinnamon cave. One boy in Montmartre insisted that the one near the bakery smells like grandma's closet. City officials, seeing an unexpected hit, leaned into it. They commissioned different signature blends for each district. The Latin Quarter got sandalwood and ink. Montparnasse was assigned rose and tobacco, pig ale. For reasons no one has ever confirmed, got musk and orange blossom, and the Marais, the historic Jewish quarter, was given myrrh and clova blend, both ancient and oddly spicy. Suddenly, walking through Paris became a fragrant map, a nasal GPS system powered by street-level psychology. Historians still argue whether this was deliberate branding or accidental folklore. But what's certain is that Parisians began associating certain smells with specific feelings: nostalgia, safety, familiarity, even civic pride. My Vespasian is cleaner than yours became a low-key neighborhood boast. But of course, no good smell goes unmarketed. Perfume houses, always on the lookout for trends, began offering public-inspired scents. One company released a cologne called Eau de Rue, street water. Its tagline: smell like home, even when abroad. Another brand sold Violet du Metro, promising commuters the aroma of underground tranquility, minus the crowd. A few years later, a London columnist visiting Paris wrote, "This city reeks, not of sin, but of system. Every odor has a job, every corner a signature." And while most cities battled urban odor with soap and shame, Paris had decided to embrace its funk, refine it, elevate it, and, in the strangest way, advertise it. It wasn't always smooth. Some neighborhoods objected to their assigned scent. Belleville residents felt eucalyptus made them smell like hospitals. Others demanded more floral notes. One group of artists petitioned for their corner urinal to smell like wet paint and crushed dreams. The city politely declined. Even within City Hall, the debates raged. Should perfumes rotate seasonally? Should they match local produce? Should tourists get scratch and sniff maps? In the end, the program settled into quiet routine. By 1895, more than 60% of Vespasians were scented. Every month, a small army of aromatic technicians refilled the chambers, checked for leaks, and jotted notes about olfactory decay curves. It was the least glamorous job in perfume and the most civic, dash-minded. And here's the twist: it worked. Public urinal complaints dropped by 40% over the next decade. Locals began defending the system. One woman even wrote a love letter, titled "To the Man Who Smells Like Pine and Paper." So tonight, as you pass that old green crescent, its base worn, smooth, its shadow swallowed in street lamp, haze, you inhale deeply. It smells like memory, like something carefully designed to remind you that this corner of the world, despite all its strange compromises and bodily functions, cared how it made you feel. You didn't just pass through Paris. Paris passed through your nose. And maybe that's the real lesson. Civic design isn't always about sight or sound. Sometimes, the way to tame a city is through your scent trail. You wake to the soft echo of boot heels on cobblestone. Somewhere nearby, a lamplighter's pole scrapes faintly against the base of a gaslight. But tonight's story doesn't hover in twilight for long. It slips straight into scandal. Because here in 1880s Paris, scent is no longer just a solution to odor. It's a battleground. That's right. It didn't take long before the idea of perfumed urinals, those oddly charming, violet-scented contraptions, turned political. Because, as you're learning now, nothing in 19th century France stayed simple for long. Not even pea smell. Set the stage. By now, Public enthusiasm for the city's scented Vespasians had reached a strange fever pitch. Poets wrote verses about bitter cedar breeze wafting up from sewer grates. Foreign journalists waxed lyrical about the olfactory topography of Paris, and the municipal council had begun to talk about standardizing scent districts, a terrifyingly bureaucratic phrase that meant things were about to get contentious. Because once scent became policy, it also became power. You see, every scent, assignment each blend of pine, clove, or lavender, wasn't just an aesthetic choice. It said something about a neighborhood's identity, and when identity is at stake, well, people get nosy. Take the Quartier Latin, for instance. Known for its students, its cafés, and its left-wing political chatter. When the city assigned it a scent blend of sandalwood and dusty parchment, a group of law students erupted. They said it smelled like a colonial archive, not a modern intellectual center. One even wrote an angry pamphlet titled, "We do not reek of empire." Just to the north, the working-class area of Boulleville fared no better. Their designated blend eucalyptus and camphor was immediately rejected. One furious resident told a newspaper, "We're not a sanatorium. We want to smell like courage, not cough drops." Then came Montmartre, artistic Montmartre, with its dancers and painters and bohemian dreams. The city gave them musk and orange blossom, likely as a cheeky nod to their risk nightlife. Local priests complained. Prostitutes celebrated. Painters shrugged. One writer called it a fragrance of sin with notes of sunshine. Still, not everyone hated their assigned blend in the Marais. A historically Jewish quarter, residents welcomed their signature of myrrh and clove. It reminded many of old family homes, Sabbath candles, and apothecaries. One shopkeeper called it the smell of tradition, softened by civic pride. Meanwhile, in Passy, the upscale western neighborhood, the blend was bergamot and cedar, elegant, discreet, it reeked of money. Critics grumbled, it was just expensive cologne, but Passy didn't care. Their urinals smelled like drawing rooms now. Let's talk about the people behind these decisions. Officially, the scents were chosen by a small panel of municipal hygienists and atmospheric advisors. In practice, though, the real power sat with an obscure committee called the Kumite d'Olfaction, Urbain the Urban Scent Committee. Yes, that was their real name. This committee included a former chemist from the House of Guerlain, to medical inspectors, a city archivist with an unusually sensitive nose, and, inexplicably, Madame Clemence Berger, a widow who owned a flower shop and had once published a book of sonnets titled "The Wind Smells of Iron." Historians still argue whether Clemence had any official credentials, or if she simply had a persuasive way of spraying lilac into every meeting. This eclectic group met once a month in a tiled back room of the Hôtel de Ville there. They reviewed scent reports, citizen complaints, and samples sent in little glass files. These they sniffed, discussed, and rated using an elaborate scoring system that included such categories as emotive lift, aggression, deflection, puddle neutralization, lingerability. When they settled on a blend, the formula was recorded in a leather ledger marked "O official." To this day, those ledgers sit untouched in the archives municipales, still faintly fragrant if you dare to open them. Of course, once politics seeped in, money wasn't far behind. Perfume houses started lobbying the committee. They hosted salons, gave out free samples, even invited city officials to scent dinners, where each course was paired with an aroma. One evening featured violet-scented foie gras, served with a side of jasmine-stuffed endive. No one remembers the food, but the scent contracts. Oh, they flowed like wine. Then came the protests. Some groups claimed the program was a cover for gentrification. "They perfume us," said one Belleville activist, "then price us out." Others complained of olfactory classism. One editorial argued, "In Passy, one pisses into bergamot. In the 10th, we marinate in pine tar. Tell me that is not policy by the nose." Things hit a peak in 1887, when a group of anarchists staged the world's first and, perhaps only scent riot. Dressed in red sashes and waving satchels of raw onions, they marched to Place de la Bastille, chanting "Down with Jasmine, up with truth." Then they doused several Vespasians in vinegar, demanding neutral scent for neutral citizens. The committee, rattled but determined, issued a new rule: no more food-based scents. Too provocative, they declared. Still, the drama faded as time wore on. By the 1890s, the public's fascination with perfumed urinals had settled into a kind of sleepy acceptance. The politics quieted. Clements retired. One final scandal. Someone had added vetiver to the Latin Quarter without authorization, made a brief stir, but no riots followed. In retrospect, the whole affair reads like a Parisian opera. Act 1, idealism. Act 2, outrage. Act 3, musk. And now, years later, you pass a crumbling old Vespasian in a forgotten alley. Its brass is dull, its pipework silent. But if you lean close, Shazeb, and inhale just deeply enough, there's still a hint of something floral, something political, something beautifully absurd. It smells like a city that once tried to assign meaning by bottle. You're walking. Maybe it's late evening, maybe early morning. You've lost track. The sky is washed in dusty lavender, and your boots echo on the cobbled street. But something else is guiding you. Not a signpost, not a bell tower, not even the outline of the Seine. No, it's your nose. Because here, in 1890s Paris, you don't just see where you re-smell it. And believe it or not, that was the whole idea. The scented urinals, which began as an effort to mask public odor, had by now evolved into something utterly unexpected: a functioning, citywide olfactory map, a way for people, especially the illiterate, the foreign, the lost, and the dreamers to navigate Paris by scent. It was never planned like this. No committee intended it. No minister made a decree. It just happened. Let's take a night stroll. Together you begin your walk near the Gare de l'Est, where the scent is sharp green and acidic pine tar and machine oil. It suits the station's energy. Trains wheeze, porters shout, and travelers with coal-smudged faces rush past. You know, even with your eyes closed, you're at the edge of industrial Paris. Walk a few blocks southwest. The air softens. Somewhere near the canal, St. Martin, a warm note of bitter almond and hay floats up. You're near working-class cafés now, where old men sip pastis and kids bounce balls off shuttered shop fronts. A little farther, the scent of cinnamon and musk slinks around a corner. Opagale. You've just crossed into the dancehall district. Somewhere an accordion moans. At Rue des Martyrs, a breeze carries the smell of rose and chalk. That's how you know you're climbing toward the art schools, where the street is half paintbrushes, half dash pastries, and if you take a wrong turn, no problem. Suddenly you're in the Latin Quarter, and you know it because the scent shifts again, this time to leather and ink. The libraries are close. So are the bookbinders and cafés where poets duel over absinthe. You don't need a street map. You don't need a guide. You just breathe. This unintentional urban feature became so common, so familiar, that Parisians began referencing it casually. You'd hear directions like, go 2 cents down from the jasmine, then turn left when it smells like smoke. You're close. I think I smell cedar. That's the hospital district. No, this isn't the bakery street. This is the Anise Street. You're 1 arrondissement too far. For the sight-tempered, the illiterate, or immigrants unfamiliar with French signage, it became an unexpected lifeline. Even tourists found themselves relying on it. Many travel guides of the time began, including scent notes in their walking tours. From Notre Dame, proceed westward toward the buttery tobacco scent. You'll know you've gone too far. If the air grows minty, naturally, artists began to take notice. Painters tried to capture the scents on canvas. Poets wrote verses titled Rue des Violettes, and Where Musk Meets Metal. A short-lived theater group staged a play called The 5 Noses of Paris, in which each act was performed in a differently scented room. And in 1892, a man named Lucien Papillon did something astonishing. Papillon was a failed geographer, a part-time surveyor, and a full-time eccentric. He had no official job with the city, but after spending several months wandering through every arrondissement, sniffing, noting, and recording, he published the world's first olfactory atlas of Paris. It was hand-drawn, color-coded, annotated with both fragrance components and emotional impressions. Each district was represented by a blend hopeful cinnamon for the 3rd, mechanical juniper for the 10th, seductive lavender for the 18th, and in the corner of the map, a legend. These scents are ephemeral. But then again, so is direction. It was dismissed by city officials as absurd. It sold only 47 copies. But years later, it would be hailed as a visionary act of sensory cartography. Even more remarkable, some urban legends began to grow. There were whispers of lovers finding each other by scent, tracing one another's path through musk and myrrh. A blind girl supposedly navigated all the way from Montparnasse to Les Halles entirely by nose. And in 1895, an old man claimed he could predict the weather by changes in the urinal scents. He wasn't entirely wrong. Warm days intensified floral notes. Rain dulled citrus. Wind could carry cedar 5 streets away. And in autumn, when the trees turned and the river rose, the whole city shifted scenta. Seasonal perfume that layered the artificial with the organic. Of course, this fragile scent map wasn't permanent. By the turn of the century, the automobile arrived. The air thickened with exhaust. Public hygiene programs changed. The scented Vespasians grew fewer. Some fell into disrepair. Others were quietly removed. People stopped giving directions by scent. The Papillon Atlas was forgotten, tucked between tax rolls and trade ledgers in the municipal archive. There was a time when a city let you follow your nose home, and in that time, a man didn't need signs, nor stars, nor street numbers. He just needed a deep breath and memory. You're still walking, but slower now. The gas lamps flicker behind you, and the streets of old Paris lean close, like an aging friend, whispering memories in the language of stone and scent. Everything feels like it's retreating, fading into the corners of your senses, like a smell you knew once, but can no longer name. Because by 1905, the scent revolution had quietly come to an end. Not with protest, not with a bang, but with a series of small, tired decisions. The same way most empires collapse not through force, but through forgetfulness. Let's pause here, because this part of the story is not about invention, or scandal, or poetry. It's about disappearance. It begins, as many endings do, with progress. As the 20th century dawned, Paris embraced new ideals: sanitation, uniformity, efficiency. The city that once celebrated its perfumed urinals now saw them as outdated relics. They were too quirky, too unpredictable, too human. New laws required public toilets to be more standardized, more hygienic, more gender-neutral. Engineers replaced open-air Vespasians with sealed kiosks, drab, tiled, functional. Inside, yes, there was plumbing. But there was no fragrance, no art, no story, and the Comite d'Olfaction Urbaine disbanded. Their ledgers, heavy with scent notes and civic dreams, were boxed up and buried deep in the municipal archive. Clemens Berger had passed away. The chemist from Guerlain returned to private life. No one remembered the scoring categories: emotive lift, lingerability, aggression, deflection. It all vanished like mist on morning stone, one by one. The old perfumed urinals were shut down by 1910. Only 7 remained. By 1922, by 1932, just one crumbling, half covered in ivy, ignored by city maps. And in 1934, it too was removed, replaced by a modern pissoir, so sterile, it might as well have been a post office. Not one newspaper marked its demolition. Not a single writer mourned it. A revolution in urban scent, one that had once involved poets, anarchists, artists, and perfume houses, ended in total silence. Well, almost total. Because history, as you know by now, has a strange way of clinging to the corners of things, and in this case, it clung to an old man named Etienne Roux. Etienne had been a boy during the fragrant peak of Paris around 1886. He remembered running errands with his father, a cobbler, and using the public sense to find his way home. Clove, near the café. Good. Almost there. Lavender, near the canal. Oops. Turn back. Turpentine and citrus. That meant the alley by the tailors to him. It had never been strange. Just normal. A part of growing up. But when he grew old, and the smells disappeared. Etienne began to realize what had been lost. He wasn't a historian, or a poet, or a rebel. He was just a retired cobbler with a notebook and a sharp nose. But he remembered, in 1951, at the age of 73. Etienne began a small project. Every morning he walked a different route through Paris, noting what was left of the old scent map. Not much by then, but here and there, the past lingered. A rusted pipe near Rue Mouffetard still gave off a faint pine resin smell. The basement of an old theater in Pigalle carried a trace of orange blossom. A storm drain behind Les Halles, wet cedar, and old lilac. Faint, but real. He kept detailed notes in a black leather notebook. For the next 11 years, he did this nearly every day until his death in 1962. When his daughter found the notebook, she didn't throw it away. She couldn't explain why, but she kept it safe. It passed down to her son, who donated it without fanfare to a local university archive in 1987. There, it sat in a file labeled Rue Etienne, Urban Observations Fragrance. No one read it for 30 years, but in 2019, a young researcher named Camille Dubois stumbled across it while looking for material on early street signage. She flipped through the first pages, puzzled, then curious, then wide-eyed, and by the end, she was weeping. The notebook had no grand theories, just memories. Streets and scents, and a city that had once believed smell mattered. Camille published a paper, then a book, then an exhibit, and suddenly the world remembered again. In 2021, Paris opened a small museum wing titled La Carte Invisible, the forgotten scent map of Paris. Inside, visitors walked through reconstructed scent corridors, recreations of Pigalle, Beauville, Montmartre, and more. Using modern olfactory technology, engineers rebuilt the old urinal fragrances from chemical residue found in preserved pipe fragments. People cried. Journalists wrote articles titled, "Paris Once Had a Nose, and the Smell of Memory." And in a quiet corner of the exhibit stood Etienne's notebook, opened to a page that read, "Near the bakery by Rue Claire. It used to smell like nutmeg and shoes. Now it smells like dust and heat. Still I walk. I remember." So now, when you next wander through your own city, Karachi, Lahore, Multan, Peshawar, wherever you may be, pause by a drain, a park, a market corner, breathe in. Ask yourself, what will this smell like when it's gone? Because perhaps one day, 100 years from now, someone will wonder what your city once smelled like. And maybe, just maybe, you'll have been the one who noticed that. You, with your long memory. You, with your night walks. You, with your nose pointed like a compass toward the past. Sleep now. History remembers those who remember it, especially when they remember by scent.